You're listening to The Christmas Killer, Book 2 of the Cottage Grove Mysteries by Julie Carobini, created with digital narration. 1. Tasha curled up her nose. Smells deadly. Lorena dipped a long-handled ladle into a pot and filled it to the brim with a bubbling brew. Here, she said, thrusting the smoky concoction toward Tasha. Just try it. Not on your life. Fine. I'll do it. Lorena blew on the contents of the ladle and carefully took a sip. She smacked her lips together and shut her eyes. Oh brother, Tasha said, laughter twinging her voice. What's that smell, licorice? The camp cook's eyes opened and sparkled. Anise, my friend. It's a lovely little spice that makes this Christmas beverage extra special. That and the whiskey I tossed in during the last few minutes of cooking. Whiskey. Sometimes in life, my dear, there's a need for something stronger. Tasha knew what her friend was talking about, and it wasn't alcohol. Not that they both didn't enjoy sitting outside on a warm fall night while sipping a nice Moscow Mule. But the days were shrinking as the hours moved swiftly toward winter, and though they laughed and ate and drank together as much as possible, a pall had descended on their beloved little town of Cottage Grove. And nobody seemed to have a plan for how to fix it. Lorena's husband, George, stepped into the room and gave his wife a bear hug. He released her with regret, stepped over to the coat rack next to the front door, and plucked a thick plaid jacket from a peg. Sorry, I have to run, hun. Lorena shrugged. It's your job. George slid a glance at Tasha before lowering his eyes again to his wife. The affection in his gaze was palpable, causing Tasha to miss her boyfriend Marc all the more while he worked on a huge construction project out of town. George, too, worked down the hill as a firefighter on duty for multiple days at a time. Say you'll miss me. Tasha felt her cheeks redden at the private moment being played out in front of her. She took a step back to give them some space, but there was really nowhere to hide in the small cabin that Lorena and George shared. Of course I'll miss you. Ya big lug. Lorena said, inadvertently swinging that ladle of hers, a splash of wassail landing somewhere on the linoleum tiles between them. He smiled big at her now. That's my girl. I will see you in 3 days, okay? He bent and kissed her forehead. And no more early morning walks for you until I'm back. Scared me half to death when I woke up and you were nowhere to be found. She slapped a gentle palm on the front of his chest. You worry too much. Something sad passed across George's face, and Tasha could scarcely miss the feeling in the pit of her that Lorena's husband's heart held more than a little concern for his wife. Tasha had felt it too, and for quite some time. Lorena had been keeping her head held high, but Tasha believed that the slow demise of her days as head camp cook was affecting her, perhaps more deeply than even she had expected. George gave Lorena one more peck on the cheek before heading out the door. And watch it with that whiskey. His voice was playful as he jogged down the steps 2 at a time, climbed into his truck and drove off to save the world. Tasha turned to look at her friend. Early morning walks? You. Lorena scoffed. I'll have you know I've been opening up a camp kitchen early for years. Well sure, so you could order all of us minions around. Though she worked as the camp bookkeeper, Tasha still found herself helping out in the kitchen on particularly busy days. At least, that was before recent changes at the camp. Ha! Like you ever really needed a job. Quit complaining and come over here and try this wassail already. Oh, that's right. The one with the whiskey in it. For heaven's sake, it's just a touch. Lorena set down the ladle. It could use a little more, actually. I'll have to remember that for next month's Christmas party up at the camp. That's what today is all about, by the way, planning that bad boy way ahead of time. With her free hand, she reached over to another large pot on the stove and gave it a quick stir. Tasha took a sip, reveling in the drink's warmth. Just what parents want, to send their kids away to camp to be exposed to underage drinking. And by the cook no less. I meant the party for grown-ups, sweet Tasha. Tisk tisk. Who do you think I am, a criminal? Lorena's cheeks shone with a peachy glow, likely from the heat of the stove. Yet both women understood the weight of the word criminal, especially after Tasha barely escaped a dangerous one's clutches around this same time last year. Tasha tried not to think about that morning last year, when she awoke alone in the wilderness, drugged and bound. The thought nearly curdled her stomach. She glanced at Lorena, aware of the unchained way she hummed, "Here we go a-wassailing," as she worked. It was obvious to Tasha that her pal had chosen not to allow the drama of the past few months to get in her way of planning the best and brightest camp Christmas party ever. "Maybe I should invite everyone by Facebook this year," Tasha said, keeping the mood between them light. "Facebook? I could do a virtual party invitation. We'll save the camp money on stamps and paper. Not to mention the time she'll save not having to fold and seal all those envelopes." "Good luck with that," Lorena said. "The younger ones would welcome it for sure, but the old-timers won't even know what you're talking about. Can you imagine Eleanor Gerbasi on Facebook? Or Mary Lou, for that matter?" "Mary Lou updates the town's Welcome Wagon Facebook page sometimes." Lorena stopped for a brief second and pondered that. "You're right. She does. But you have a point about Eleanor. She must be, 90 years old?" Lorena kept puttering with the wassail. Something like that." Tasha threw open both hands. "Okay, forget it. Of course I'll send out regular invitations, just like the old days. Nicer somehow, anyway." Agreed. Truly, all did feel calm for the first time in a while. But could they ignore the obvious for much longer? Tasha steeled herself. She tilted her head to one side, a renegade curl flopping in front of her face. "Lorena." "Oh now," Lorena said, one eyebrow wrinkling like a caterpillar, "don't give me that look. I'm just going to say it." "Do you? Well, do you think there will be a Christmas party this year? I mean now that." That strawberry blonde brow rose above Lorena's right eye. "You mean now that the camp staff's been traumatized at every turn, and there's been the aroma of mutiny in the air. And here I thought that was a new marinara recipe I'd been smelling. Why tinker with perfection?" Lorena shot back. "Naturally." Lorena cleared her throat. "What you really meant was, will there be a party now that I've been demoted, and it's always been my event to ruin?" "I didn't say that. Not exactly, anyway." "Why not? It's the truth. When Bain and Beckett Adair brought Cooper Eaton back to Cottage Grove, he took over the camp in that ornery I-know-everything way of his, like this was boot camp rather than a place for kids and families to fall in love with nature. Nearly half the staff quit. Then he brought in that sister of his, oy vey. One look at Beth, and I knew she wouldn't be appreciating my comfort food anytime soon. Barista milk in the refrigerator. A wine bar to replace the game room? Please." She released a dejected sigh into the small but comfortable room. "It's no surprise he reduced me to part-time. The day his sister's designer-clad feet marched into my kitchen, and she sneered at my black Skechers, then turned up that chiseled little nose of hers at the 50-pound bag of russets in the pantry, I knew my job was toast. Still, all of it was rather unexpected." Lorena shook her head. "I could have quit. Everybody still wants, to know why I didn't. But that's not me." Lorena does not whimper at the first sign of adversity. Tasha knew this to be true. She witnessed Lorena's fortitude firsthand when, after falling off the roof of Tasha's cottage and spraining her wrist during a bad storm, Lorena continued to run the camp kitchen with one arm wrapped tighter than a German sausage. No, she did not give up easily. But Cooper, well, Cooper didn't either. Tasha bit her bottom lip, holding back a whistle. Sharp dresser or not, the new camp director was one strange dude. And from what she'd heard, he'd been that way since childhood. Like the Adair brothers who owned the place now, Cooper and Beth had grown up here, though none of them had lived in Cottage Grove for years. "In the end," Lorena continued, "Cooper needs me. Not to run the kitchen, as I have done for quite some time, but to clean up after his head in the clouds, hot from culinary school sister." She pronounced sister like the word had been dredged in rancid oil and coated with lard. Tasha shrugged. I'll still never understand why Pastor Rick was ousted to make room for a tyrant of a camp director like Cooper. None of it makes sense. I'll say. The doorbell rang. Lorena dropped the ladle back into the pot, pulled a towel off its bar and wiped down her hands while charging for the door, all the while muttering under her breath. I know this is a small town and all, but who doesn't call first these days? Officer Wesley stood there, his beady eyes holding steady on her like the barrel of a gun. If you're looking for handouts for the next police union's rodeo, I gave at the office. Tasha pressed her lips together as she watched her friend threaten to close the door on one of Cottage Grove's finest. Oh, she knew it wasn't right, but she was also well aware of Lorena's disdain for Wes ever since he jumped to conclusions and arrested Marc Shepard, Tasha's boyfriend, for a crime he didn't commit. Acid churned Tasha's stomach again, and she swallowed against it. No sense replaying last year's ugly mess. It was over, and that's all that mattered. Thankfully, Tasha's sleuthing days were far behind her now. Officer Wesley didn't crack a smile. Not unusual, really. Wes rarely found anything funny, even when the rest of the town seemed to cackle and crow at every hometown parade, carnival, and pie-eating contest. He stood there, somber as an undertaker, no flinch in his demeanor even as Lorena pushed the door closed again. His hand shot out, stopping her from slamming it in his face. Though he did not otherwise move forward, his fingers curled around the edge of the door. I need to speak with you, Lorena. About. This time his eyes shifted toward Tasha. Lorena sighed. Oh, for heaven's sake. Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of Tasha. He chewed on that a moment, releasing his grip on the door, while not moving his hand away completely. His stubbled chin scraped the air, as if considering whether what he might have to say would better be held for a later time, or spilled right there in the open, with his boot-shod feet still cradled in sagging porch boards. He locked one side of his jaw for a moment, considering Lorena from beneath the brim of that black cap of his. He was never without it. Suit yourself. I've got some news. Well, okay then, spill it. We haven't got all day now. Technically, they did have all day since George was away, and Marc was working on a construction project that, though it had begun on a high note, was slowly beginning to sound more like an off-key chorus. He had been gone for days. With their men away and the camp closed for the weekend, the two women had planned to spend several hours trying out new recipes for the holiday season, while alternately listening to episodes of House Hunters and Chopped. Wes's presence spoiled all that. Not to mention all the unsavory talk of the latest goings-on at their beloved camp Cottage Grove. You might want to turn off your stove, Lorena. I have some questions to ask you. Lorena's face seemed to lose a bit of color as she stood there, considering the cloak of seriousness that Officer Wesley had brought with him into the tiny cabin. She fiddled with her apron, wiping her hands over and over again until abruptly she jabbed both fists into that soft space above her hips. Ask away. Tasha stepped into the kitchen, silently checking to make sure both burners were on simmer. She slipped back in next to Lorena on the couch across from Wes, who now sat in George's recliner. Officer Wesley flipped open a notepad, the scrape of a page turning reminiscent of a year ago when he had come to Tasha's small cabin, intent on answers. Do you know a Cooper Eaton? Lorena rolled her eyes. For heaven's sake, Wes, everybody in town knows Cooper since he grew up here. And those who are new around here know he's the camp director. She grumbled something unintelligible under her breath. He bent over that notepad and jotted something down. Aha. When was the last time you saw Mr. Eaton? Why? Is he missing? Wes shot a look upward. When was it that you last saw Mr. Eaton? Lorena hesitated. She glanced at Tasha and then back at Wes. I don't know. Let me think. Tasha leaned toward her. You worked a couple of hours yesterday, I think. Right. Don't coach her, Wes barked. Yes. Yes, I did. Lorena nodded at Tasha. We didn't talk, but I saw him through the kitchen blinds yesterday when I was over there taking inventory for Chef Queen. Queen, he asked. Lorena cleared her throat. Cooper's sister. She's the new camp chef, and her name's Beth. But I call her Queen. He zeroed in on her with confused everyman's eyes. You know, like Queen Elizabeth? Without a sound, Officer West jotted something in his notepad. Wes? Tasha broached. What is this about? Has Cooper done something that we should know about? Wes flipped shut his notepad and stood, staring them both down as if he had never broken bread with them, or savored barbecue chicken legs, over a wooden table at a town potluck. This Wes, Officer Wesley, was a complete and baffling stranger. With his jaw set and his voice somber, he said, Considering Cooper Eaton is dead, I can't imagine that he has been able to do anything at all. 2. Tasha's heart pounded hard against the wall of her chest. She climbed the last hill toward her cabin in the woods that perched precariously on a cliff above the rushing sea. It was an odd paradox, her home. Nestled among towering pines and dense green foliage, and yet perilously and beautifully close to the majestic Pacific Ocean. She'd found a steal a year ago in her fixer-upper and never looked back. Granted, Cottage Grove was as underdeveloped as a seedling after a harsh winter, but who was she to announce to the masses what a deal they were missing? Residents had to deal with an unreliable postal service, soggy roads, and fellow town dwellers who seemingly knew everybody's business. But it was worth it to each and every one of them who had acquired a home for a decent price, even if many of those dwellings seemed to need a lot of work. Inside her cabin, Tasha warmed at the sight of the new kitchen cabinets that Marc had hung for her, white with an antiqued finish that they had completed together. She a willing student, and he an affectionate teacher. If she had not fallen in love with a contractor next door, no doubt she would still be storing her plates and mugs in the flimsy pressed wood cabinets that hung on these walls when she'd first bought the place more than a year ago. But they had fallen in like, and then love, and the next thing she knew, the project she had bought for herself to work on while she nursed a broken heart had evolved into something they spent spare time on together. She missed him. But she understood that the McLaren project was something Marc could not pass up. Not if he intended to grow his construction firm into something beyond the handyman status that the locals had clung to. With a flourish, her phone began to beep, the dings coming in rapid succession. She looked at the screen and saw that she'd missed a phone call from Marc. And then several texts followed. I heard the news. Call me. Tash, promise me you'll steer clear. Tasha. I'll be up there ASAP. Call me. Please. She sucked in a breath. Another peril of living in this mountainous and somewhat isolated region was the absence of cell phone service while on hikes. Tasha glanced at her screen and spotted the presence of a Wi-Fi signal now that she had entered the cabin. That signal had been AWOL all morning. She punched in Marc's number. Hi, she said when he answered, it's me. Tasha. Relief flowed through his voice. Thank God. She tucked a coiled strand of hair behind her ear and grinned. Sorry to scare you. I couldn't sleep, so I got up early and went on a hike. She paused. It's beautiful here. In other words, I miss you. Marc's tone turned husky. Next time you can't sleep, call me. I'll answer anytime, day or night. She chuckled. 5 a.m. You'd answer then? You know I would. A thrill ran through her. She grabbed a glass from the cabinet and began filling it with water, clearing her head. So, she said, watching the glass fill, you wanted to talk to me. She turned off the faucet and took a lengthy sip. I got your voicemail, but not until late. Did they find out how Cooper died? I don't know. But Wes, well, you know Wes, he was being very cryptic. I heard that he was found at the bottom of the cliff. They don't know if he had a heart attack and fell or if someone pushed him. Plenty of people around here wanted to. Tash. I'm just saying. I never wished the man ill will or anything, but you have to admit he wasn't popular. She set the empty glass in the sink. Lorena reminded me yesterday that half the staff quit after he took over the camp. And he brought his sister in to displace her. Oh my gosh, his poor sister. Wretched as the woman may be, her brother is dead. How is she handling it? Tasha looked out her kitchen window to the peekaboo of the sea in the distance, beyond the pines. No idea. Nobody has heard from her. After we heard the news yesterday and Wes came by with his cryptic questions, Lorena and I did our best to salvage what was left of our plans. We were like zombies, really, going through the motions of planning a Christmas party of all things, but without much emotion. She stepped away from the window and leaned her back against the polished granite countertop. Oh, Marc. The implications for the camp, the community. And Lorena. She straightened. What do you mean? She'll keep her job, I'm sure. Tasha, Wes wouldn't have been questioning her unless he was trying to figure out if she was somehow involved with Cooper's death. You have to be joking. There's no way. Granted, she didn't like the guy, but who did? She shook her head. As I recall, Cooper had been acting sick for a few days. Hadn't really thought of that until now. Anyway, I'm sure Wes was just trying to pin down the time of death or something. And you say that because? Well, because he asked when the last time it was that she'd seen him. Tash. That doesn't mean she's being implicated. No way. She shook her head in the empty space. You don't think he was trying to trap her or something? Do you? I don't think he's smart enough for that. But I do have to tell you, Tash, Wes called me this morning. What? Why? I don't really know. Seems the way the body was found, there's some thought that he was drugged. No way. You didn't hear that from me. Of course not. But he couldn't think that Lorena would have something to do with it. She provided him food and drink, so she's on the radar. Do you happen to know where she was yesterday morning? With me. Like I said, she and I were sampling wassail for the annual Christmas party. He laughed, though it didn't sound as jovial as usual. No alcohol in it, I hope. Just a little. I see. Seriously, where was she before that? Did she tell you? Why are you asking this? I told you already that she was with me. You don't think she really had anything to do with Cooper's death? I don't, but Wes does. And if she doesn't have a sufficient alibi for where she was that morning, she should probably find a lawyer. You're not serious. I'm sorry to say that I am. His voice was kind. Did she say anything at all to you about what she was doing that morning? Was George in town to back her up? Yes. Wait. Yes, he was in town. But she said something about taking a walk early that morning. George actually admonished her not to do that while he was gone. He left the cabin yesterday to head down the hill for another few days at the fire station. She slapped the counter. Fine. I'll just ask her where she took that walk. Surely somebody saw her. No. Don't get involved with this. Let the police handle it. Are you serious? No way will I let this get pinned on Lorena. I have to warn her and talk to her before Wes and his scrappy team somehow find a way to incriminate an innocent woman. Don't do anything dangerous, Tasha. You and I both remember the last time you snooped around. Exactly. And if anything happened to you, I'd never forgive myself. He paused. Look, I know this project is taking a ton of my time, but hold tight. I'll be up there soon, and if you still need to get involved, promise you'll let me go with you. To talk to Lorena. That's silly. You know as well as I do that you're planning to do a lot more than talk to Lorena. Tasha had managed a lot in her young life, a corporate career, a broken engagement, owner of a fixer-upper in one of the most beautiful areas of the state, but lying would never be something that she could add to her resume. Her parents had raised her an only child, to be honest to a fault. Marc knew this, of course. And so when he had cornered her with that statement, she could do nothing but cry, "Uncle." Yes, as a matter of fact, she had been thinking about doing more than talking to Lorena. A lot more. Through the windshield of her Subaru, Tasha eyed the sprawling two-story building affectionately known as Main Camp. The wood-sided chocolate-brown building housed a smattering of offices, the kitchen, and the cavernous dining hall, whose linoleum floors bore the scuff marks of generations of kids and their future families. 2 vehicles were parked in the poorly lit parking lot. A police cruiser and a Jeep Grand Cherokee with black paint so slick it looked more like a luxury vehicle than something someone might want to take off-road. A light glowed from a first-floor window. Camp Cottage Grove had become a second home to Tasha. She didn't need the paltry sum of money she earned there, nearly as much as the camaraderie she'd found when she had needed it most. At first, the camp was a place to help her keep her bills at bay. She didn't have many when she moved to the area, but savings could only go so far. Quickly, though, the camp became the site of some of her favorite memories and people, including Marc and of course her pal Lorena. When she had called the camp earlier in the day, no one had answered. Word had spread that camp was closed until further notice, but she came to see for herself. And for answers. She blew out a breath, fogging the window, and considered what she would say to the men who gathered there. "Better get on it," she muttered aloud, as she unlocked her car door and stepped out. Tasha's boots tread over fallen pine needles as she made her way to the mudroom at the back of the kitchen. It didn't matter where she was scheduled to work on a particular day, whether in the office or helping Lorena out in the kitchen, Tasha always entered main camp through the mudroom, usually inhaling the aroma of something delicious. Sadly, only the vaporous scent of antiseptic greeted her this time. Deep voices emanated from the dining hall just off the kitchen, one of them rising in pitch as she made her way past stacked dishes, folded towels, and a gleaming commercial-grade espresso maker so new that even Lorena had yet to learn how to use it, though heaven knew she had tried. She stopped short of announcing her presence and instead hung back amidst the cast-iron pots that swung from the ceiling, peering through the pass-through that was partly open between the kitchen and the hall. 3 men sat on weathered pumpkin-colored couches that flanked the old rock fireplace. At this time of year, those couches were the preferred place for all-around lounging and hanging out, even though Cooper had been threatening to toss them in the dumpster, but today they looked anything but welcoming. Last summer, the 2 investors who had quietly purchased the property where the camp was housed began to make significant changes. Bain and Beckett, aka Beck, Adair's family had run the place when they were young, but eventually the men left home to attend college. For a dozen or so years, both men had settled far away from the insignificant town that had given them many school years of wanderlust and summers of blessed idleness. At first, their reintroduction into town had been a bit of a curiosity, but after they fired Pastor Rick, the camp's longtime director, and replaced him with Cooper Eaton, a hush began to whistle its way through the groves, settling itself on the porches of residents when the days became too warm to do anything but muse. Tasha again peered into the hall. Officer Wesley, held his trademark notepad open, a pen poised above it, and his face held a sneer that couldn't be missed. "Something doesn't add up," he was saying. "I'll say something doesn't add up." Bain, the shorter of the 2 siblings, jumped to his feet, pivoted, and pointed a finger in his brother's face. "This place has got to go, I've said it before. It's bleeding money. Now this." Beck held up both palms. "Calm down. We've got a mess to clean up here all right, but it starts with finding out who killed Cooper." "Killed him? Nobody said anybody killed him." He turned wild-eyed toward Wes. "You said he fell or something." "That's right. So why's he saying somebody killed him?" Wes shifted. "What I said was that he was found at the bottom of the cliff, and it looked suspicious, and that's all I'm going to say. For now." Bain shook his head. "Sure isn't the place it was when we were kids back. I don't know what we were thinking when we—" The clattering of metal against metal rose through the kitchen when Tasha accidentally knocked her head on a pan hanging from the ceiling, creating a domino effect that sent one chunk of heavy metal crashing into another. "Show yourself," Wes's voice called out. Tasha stepped out from the darkened kitchen and into the hall. "It's just me." "Tasha." Beck squinted at her. "Bookkeeper, right?" No, she works in the kitchen," Bain said. Wes watched her, that face of his more serious than she had ever seen it, and she had seen a lot. "What are you doing here? How did you get in?" She held up her key. "I just came to pick up a file from the office." I know the camp is closed, but there were some things I started the other day that I thought I should finish. Bane nodded, like that made sense. Tasha started for the office. What kind of things? Beck said, intercepting her. She swung back around, thinking fast. I had started the guest list for the annual Christmas party. It's getting pretty late in the season, so I thought I would, bring the file home with me and work on it there. She paused. This is something I started helping Lorena with last year. Bane scoffed. Don't bet on holding any party here anytime soon. Tasha stilled. Really? Why not? As she waited for them to respond, Tasha noted the way Bane sent back a shut-up glare. Beck stood, pulling his wool coat from the back of the couch and slipping it on as he'd probably done hundreds of times before. Don't mind my brother. It's been a day, and we are out of answers at the moment. I say go ahead and work on your party for now. Can't hurt, and perhaps it will keep the staff from getting bored and restless. He turned to Wes. Officer, I take it we have answered all your questions sufficiently. My brother and I need to get down the hill to a prior engagement. You understand, I'm sure. Wes stood, crossed his arms and planted his legs in a wide stance. Don't go far, the officer admonished. When they had gone, Wes eyed her. Don't you have a file to retrieve? Yes, of course. She paused. I'm wondering, though, what happened to Cooper? I mean, what was it that looked suspicious about his fall? For someone with a party on her mind, sounds like you stood in that kitchen a long while. She shrugged. Hated to disturb your meeting. Aha. I mean, maybe he just fell. There's been some light rain, not to mention all that mist we get from the fog, and everyone knows those pine needles can be slippery, so really, it could have been an accident. Or maybe he had a health issue, like a heart attack or something. Wes wore a mask of contempt, the same one that shrouded his features anytime he was questioned about something he didn't care to share. Tasha had noticed that last year when she'd found herself in a mess of trouble, but also at trivial times, such as what kind of apples he put in his pie contest submission at the town fair. There's no party, is there? Of course there is. In fact, you're on the invite list, Wes. Am I? Shouldn't you be? Wes released his arms from their crossed position and grunted. He actually rolled those pebble eyes of his. For all that is good and holy, Tasha, stop nosing around, stop asking questions, just stop. And why do you care if I ask a question or two, Wes? Because. Tasha adjusted her purse strap, cinching it closer to her body. We both know that because is not an answer. I've done nothing wrong. If we're done here, I think I'll just go to the office to find my file. Wes's face softened, his eyes less angry yet just as intense. Because I don't want to find you dead, too. There was a kind of hitch in Wes's voice as he said those words, and Tasha could not help but swallow back any sort of reply. The file that was part of Tasha's ruse to enter the rustic old camp was nowhere to be found. After turning the office upside down, she turned off the light and headed back to her car. The sky was dark now, yet clear as an ocean, endless and deep. She marveled at the pattern of stars etched across its surface, and with a click of a button on her key fob, Tasha unlocked her car door. What are you doing here so late? A gulp of air lodged in Tasha's chest. She spun toward the embodiment of the voice that sounded both rich, warm, and angry. Marc. He stood with his arms folded in front of his chest, strong hands gripping his biceps. One day. I asked you to hold off for one day. He let his hands drop to his sides and hung his head. Honestly, Tash, this thing has me in knots. You shouldn't have come here. He let out a ragged sigh. In the dark. And alone. What were you thinking? Tasha stepped toward him, wrapping her arms around his waist, and looked up at him. He hadn't shaved, and she longed to feel that roughness against her lips. It's great to see you too. He growled, and she could tell, forced back a smile. What did you find? She let out a sigh and shook her head. Nothing much. When I arrived, Wes was here grilling Bane and Beck. Grilling them? That's what it sounded like to me, although I'm not sure why. I mean, as far as I've heard, there's nothing that would point to anything particularly sinister about Cooper's death. He fell down a cliff. Tragic but not unheard of. Especially for someone like Cooper. Always so jittery. That was the coffee. Even in the dark, she could tell she'd made him smile. Awful what happened to him, but yes, he liked his caffeine. Yeah, well, Wes is treating this like an investigation. She paused to nibble at the inside of her mouth. I can tell. Marc only nodded.
What did he say?
It's what he didn't say. I suggested that maybe Cooper simply fell or had a medical issue, and he just snapped. Told me to stay out of it. Marc ran his palms along the sides of her arms as if to warm her, then rested them on her shoulders. He tipped his head forward until their foreheads touched. For once, he said, his voice pleading, I agree with him. Marc? She pulled back. I smell smoke. Marc sniffed the air. Me too. He reached for the phone in his pocket and handed it to her. My truck's around back. Let's take your car. As Marc drove, Tasha called 911, although all she could do was tell the operator that she smelled smoke. They took the path deeper into the property, away from the road, noticing how the scent of smoke grew thicker, stronger as they drove. Through a thicket bordering the property on its north side, Tasha caught sight of a lick of orange. There, she said, pointing in the direction of a small house that had abutted the camp for many years. Oh no. I think it's coming from behind Eleanor's house. Hang on. That path's going to be rough. We should have taken my truck. You might want to grip that door handle real tight. They bounded over the rain-gouged path that at one time had been a well-used road. She hadn't lived here then, of course, but Tasha had heard about the good old days of Cottage Grove enough to know that the camp regularly opened up the place to residents that abutted the property. It had been a tradition to invite the neighbors, so to speak, as an official thank you and apology all rolled into one for making so much noise, especially in summertime. The residents never seemed to mind, nor complain about the excessive summer revelry going on next door, but they never turned down the quarterly barbecued tri-tip either. They reached Eleanor's rambling single-story house, the glow of fiery fall-like color marking the sky beyond the home. Looks like it's coming from the meadow, Marc called, as he shoved the car into park, threw open his door, and slid out. She followed him, but he swiveled around, stopping her with hands splayed. Stay here. We don't know how bad it is yet. It rained a few days ago, so maybe. Marc shook his head. And then that dry California wind blew through and wicked all that moisture away. The dry brush could explode. Marc? I swear, Tash. She clucked her tongue. I'm going to check the house. He nodded. Of course. Get Eleanor out of there, but be careful. And if you don't see the station's truck coming up the drive in a few seconds, call again. He took off through the stand of old pines that surrounded Eleanor's property. The thought of what a spark could do to those historic trees, and just about everything in their vicinity, caused her heart to tumble. The meticulously tended garden filled with foxglove, lupine, and poppies that surrounded the house could be lost in an instant. Worse, what would happen to poor old Eleanor? She jogged up the bare wood steps to Eleanor's porch, careful not to topple the myriad of unmatched pottery overflowing with wildflowers, and opened her dusty screen door. She placed a hand on a solid wood panel. Eleanor, she called. No answer. No time to waste. Tasha twisted the door's handle, half expecting it to be locked tight. She was wrong. The door clicked open, squeaking as it invited her in. From the nearby canyon, a siren echoed. Eleanor, she called out. The living room was dark, a little musty, and faintly acrid from a distant burn. Yet a drift of another smell caused the room to simmer with recollection. A picture of herself at age 7 or 8 emerged in Tasha's mind. She wore her favorite feet pajamas, the ones with the llamas on them, while waiting for her mother to hand her a warm cup of milk. The memory was safe, uncomplicated. She dashed a look through the pale shears toward the back of the property, where Marc had no doubt arrived to assess the trouble and fight it until help arrived. Against the darkened night, sparks snapped toward the sky before retreating to earth. Tasha let the shear fall away from her hands and recover the window. When she turned, she smacked the toe of her boot against one beefy wooden leg of the dining table, then padded over to the kitchen door that swung from its hinges. A slim fissure of light threaded its way onto her path, and she pushed the door open. Eleanor stood at the stove, stirring a pot of milk, her opaque hair pulled into a ponytail and an apron wrapped around her waist. She wore no shoes, but Tasha noticed the remnants of twigs and dried leaves that had attached themselves to the knee-high stockings that hugged her ankles. "Tasha, did I know you were coming?" Eleanor's clear eyes widened from behind her oversized glasses. The siren blared closer now, but Eleanor didn't flinch. A hint of worry over the 90-something resident's mental state crossed Tasha's thoughts. Headlights peered through the kitchen windows and ricocheted off posts and trees. She hesitated, not wanting to scare the poor woman. Then again, she had just entered her home unannounced and wandered into her kitchen, and that hadn't seemed to faze Eleanor one bit. "Eleanor," she broached, "there's a fire in the meadow. Marc's there now. Why don't you come home with me until the firefighters make sure it's all out?" "Out? Why would they want to put out my fire?" The poor woman was worse off than she had thought. "They just want you to be safe, that's all." Tasha reached for the spoon in Eleanor's hand. "I can take care of the milk for you while you go and get." But Eleanor had already dropped the spoon into the pot. She switched off the burner, then wiped her hands down the front of her apron. "Oh dear, I'd better go out there and see what all this fuss is about." Tasha shook her head. "And no, that's not necessary. We just want you to be safe." Eleanor jabbed a bony fist into her side and sighed. "My shoes are caked with mud." Tasha glanced at the woman's stockinged feet, then back up at her face. "I had to tromp a long way out there tonight. Stepped right in mud as thick as peanut butter, so I had to leave them out on the back porch." She sighed like a kindergartner after being told that recess was over. "Oh dear. If they put the fire out too early, I'll have to pay to have my trash hauled away." "Your trash?" "I knew I should have burned it before I left to visit my sister, but my brother-in-law was in such a hurry to drive me to Nevada to see her that I left everything in such a disarray." She shook her head. "It's a darn shame too. Had to light up 2 burn barrels tonight to contain all that trash I left behind." Their heads turned at a bold knock on the door, one as familiar to Tasha as the sound of her own pup's, Wolfie's, paws against bare wood floors. No surprise to Tasha, Marc stepped in through the mudroom. "Evening, ladies. You gave us all a scare, Eleanor. Don't go tellin' me that you put out my fires." "I won't be telling you any such thing. I can't promise what the fire marshal will have to say about it, though." "OPSSH." She swiped a hand in front of her face. "I changed that boy's diapers in the church nursery many moons ago, and I am not afraid to remind him of that."
"Eleanor,"
Tasha said, relief and laughter filtering through her. Marc leaned against a pantry door made of knotty pine. "Tell you what. You make me some of your banana pie, and I'll haul your trash for you whenever you need it." Tasha laughed more. "Better yet," he said with a wink, "teach this beauty right here how to make it and I'll sweep your porch for you too." Tasha gave him the death stare, but Eleanor surprisingly said nothing. Her eyes lit and her mouth opened, but just as suddenly she clammed up and looked out the window. "You okay, Eleanor?" Marc said. She looked at him, her face a momentary mask, as if she did not care to share her thoughts. Then, as quickly as she had donned that mask, it was gone. "Of course I am," she snapped. "And just so you know, I can sweep my own darn porch. Don't you forget that." Tasha laughed so hard it felt as if she couldn't breathe. 3. Marc and Tasha had stayed at Eleanor's home long enough for the fire marshal to stop in and gently remind her to notify the station before setting fires of any kind. She answered his rebuke by offering to teach his wife how to make banana cream pie the next time she had a party, and that was that. No further admonishments had been made. After the marshal left, Marc checked all of Eleanor's doors and windows, while Tasha lingered in the kitchen long enough to inform the elderly woman about Cooper's death. Was it his heart, she had asked? He always was such an agitated child. Tasha had simply told her what she knew, that he had fallen to his death, and no other information had become available. By the next morning, the few who had yet to hear of the new camp director's shocking demise had learned just as much as anyone. Mary Lou from the town's welcoming committee had taken care of that. They say he had just swallowed a blood pressure pill while reading the Wall Street Journal on the web, Mary Lou was saying to Nikki, who stood behind the counter at the Creekside Cafe where Tasha and Marc had stepped inside for breakfast. They found him at the bottom of the cliff, not a hair of that bleach blonde head of his out of place. Like he'd combed it on his way down, Nikki said. Truly. Mary Lou nodded, her eyes sober, sincere. Tasha looked at the menu, without reading it. Her eyes flipped upward to Marc, who was watching her. Think I should tell them the truth? That Wes says the whole thing looks suspicious. I do not. But there could be a killer among us, she hissed. Marc opened his mouth, but snapped it shut when Nikki approached swinging a coffee pot. He slid his cup toward the edge of the table, and Nikki obliged by filling it up. Tasha also moved her cup closer to Nikki, but didn't expect that today would be any different. She was right. Nikki did not so much as glance at the empty cup. Instead, she kept her focus on Marc and flashed those picket fence teeth at him. What can I get you today? He grinned back at her, enjoying the all-too-familiar slight toward his girlfriend much too much for Tasha's taste. Why, thank you for asking, Nikki. I am hungry this morning. With muscles like that, I bet you are. That project you're working on must be a real butt-buster. He nodded, still smiling. Something like that. Tasha kicked him under the table, and he responded by stroking her calf with the toe of his boot. Listen, Nikki, my girlfriend here would love a glass of orange juice while we think about the menu. Could you grab that for her? Sure thing, she said and sashayed away from the table without a glance at Tasha. Tasha kicked him again. He shrank back, feigning pain. Ouch. Seriously. This time he laughed and leaned forward. You make this too easy. And you encourage her. It's not me, it's my muscles. Apparently. This time Tasha was the one to laugh. Please. The harsh knock of an old bell signaled the cafe door opening behind Tasha. As it did, Marc's smile faded. Who is it? Tasha didn't wait for his answer, but swiveled around on the vinyl seat to see Beck and Bain Adair entering the cafe. Marc slid from his seat and stuck out his hand to shake Beck's when the men stopped by their table. I was sorry to hear about Cooper. Beck nodded. Quite a shock. Bain's breathing sounded jagged, as if each breath of air had to travel over a dry creek bed instead of through lungs. Terrible. Terrible news. Tasha stood and moved to the other side of the table. Would you like to sit down? Beck nodded. Thanks, he said and slid into the booth. Bain filed in next to him. Once they were all seated again, a man approached. All four sets of eyes looked up to find Pastor Rick, the former camp director, standing next to their table. Marc, Tasha, he said, then turned to the Adair brothers. Gentlemen. Pastor Rick. Hello, Tasha said. I learned about Cooper's passing yesterday, he said to the brothers. I'm terribly sorry. One of Bain's eyebrows rose. Are you, Pastor? Excuse my brother, Beck cut in. It's been a shock to us all, but I am sorry if he has offended you. To his credit, nothing in Rick Buttering's countenance revealed any sort of offense at all. And considering the Adair brothers had purchased the camp and promptly fired the longtime director, effectively shutting down years of leadership and pastoral guidance, Tasha was impressed. Nothing could be further from the truth. Like you, I only want what is best for the camp, and for the community. Thank you, Pastor, Beck said. You're welcome. If there's anything I can do to help in the interim, you know where to find me. He turned to Tasha and Marc. I truly am sorry for your loss. After he walked away, the table fell quiet until Tasha tentatively broached a new subject. Has anyone heard from Beth? Though Lorena wasn't fond of the woman who had essentially replaced her, Tasha always found her fairly pleasant, innovative even. Although why her talents for high-end cuisine had been brought to Camp Cottage Grove, Tasha would never understand. A kind of sorrow passed over Beck's face. "She's disappeared," Bane said through gritted teeth. "How can you disappear after your own brother's death?" Beck looked at his brother and then at Tasha. "Beth hasn't disappeared. She's in seclusion." The skin of Bane's forehead bunched like an old sweater. He pinned his brother with a look.
You knew this and hadn't mentioned it?
"Don't tell me she's a suspect." "Have a heart, Bane. Her brother died. What part of that don't you understand?" In the short time that Tasha had seen the two brothers in action, it had been evident that they shared blood, a name, and perhaps family money. If they had not been family, though, she doubted they would even be friends. "How do you know she's in seclusion then?" Beck sighed. "She called me. She had to break the news to her mother, and wanted my advice. She's distraught, Bane, so I told her to take all the time she needs." Bane blew out a breath, his eyes wide and unfocused as if the past couple of days, including the past few minutes, had taken their toll. Beck caught eyes with Tasha, a firm resolve in his expression. "I'm glad you're here, actually. Was planning on contacting you, so finding you now makes things easier. How can I help you?" Marc shifted next to her, but said nothing. "Beth suggested I ask you if you could run things up at the camp for a while, at least until all this blows over." She didn't ask what it might take for a sudden and suspicious death to blow over. Beck continued, "You obviously know how things run over there, where the files are, etc. A couple of groups are coming in soon to celebrate the holidays. And we don't want this mishap to scare away our guests," Bane cut in. "What he means is that we have campers coming in to celebrate the start of the holidays," said Beck, "and it might be distressing to them if they were to somehow get wind of the investigation. Do what you can to keep the environment as normal as possible. Can you do that?" "I can certainly try, but maybe it would be better to have someone seasoned step in." "Like the beloved pastor?" Bane said. Tasha shrugged. "He certainly has more experience than I do." "You're too modest," Beck said. "Look, I have nothing against the pastor, but we would prefer to keep things moving forward as Cooper laid them out. At least for now. Besides," he added, "you come highly recommended. Is this acceptable to you?" Tasha looked first at Bane and then Beck. She nodded her agreement. Marc straightened, leaning his forearms on the table.
Hold on a minute.
"What are you going to do to make sure the camp is secure? I don't want Tasha over there, especially while there are still so many questions and suspicions about Cooper's death." Tasha laid her hands on one of his. "I'll be fine. I want guarantees." Bane sighed. "I say we get one of the Wranglers to play security guard." Beck nodded. "I agree." "Great," Tasha said. "I'll go over there today to take a look at the group files. I'll need help, especially in the kitchen. I'll call Lorena to come with me." Bane shook his head. "Not while she's being investigated. With all due respect, I was there when Wes broke the news. He just had a few questions for Lorena about when she last saw him, and if she had seen anything amiss, those kinds of things. I'd hardly call that being investigated. Besides," she said, crossing her arms, "I can't do this without her." Beck nodded. "Very well. Bring her on, but tell her to keep quiet. About everything." "Will do." Bane made a move to find a table of their own, his expression tense. He slid out of the booth and began to walk away. Beck watched after his brooding brother. He stood, turning around first to shake Marc's hand and then Tasha's. "I appreciate your help," he said with half-hearted relief in his voice. "Lorena and I are a good team. Don't you worry." As Beck walked off, Tasha turned to find Marc watching her. His expression told her that Beckett Adair wasn't the only one who needed assurances right now. Wolfie snored softly under Tasha's desk in the camp office. She had allowed him to come with her despite the fact that he didn't always listen well, especially with distractions galore at the camp. Why would he come quickly when she called, when he could make better use of his time by chasing squirrels up a tree or hunting for foxes beneath low-growing ferns. When she pulled into the camp parking lot a few hours ago, Wolfie's ears had perked high enough to brush against the ceiling of the inside of her car. And Tasha had not disappointed him. At least not at first. For 30 minutes or so, she let him run free to investigate every rustle and bump that the untamed wild surrounding the camp could offer. If Marc knew of the unfettered way she and Wolfie had traipsed about the property this morning, he likely would have sent an armed guard along with them. He would have come himself, but an emergency down the hill had called. A section of scaffolding had collapsed, narrowly missing a couple of passers-by, and so Marc had left Cottage Grove in a hurry before the sun came up. It was Marc, actually, that Wolfie had to thank for his invitation to the camp. "Promise me you'll bring the Wolfster tomorrow," he'd said after learning that the camp wrangler was out of town.
He and I have an agreement.
"Oh really?" she'd said, giving her wily animal a quick pet on the back. "You know that he's known me longer than you, right?" "True, but he and I battled it out for your affection until we finally called a truce." "Oh yeah." Marc leaned forward then, his lips imploring hers. But he took a sudden detour and kissed Wolfie on the head instead. Tasha gasped, but by then Marc and Wolfie were rolling around on her wood floors growling like they were the best of buds. She rolled her eyes and knew Wolfie would be joining her at the camp in the morning. Marc had seen to that. Now as she sat at her desk in the silence of the camp, poring over the group lists for the next few weeks, her pets snoring beneath her feet gave her a sense of calm in the midst of myriad questions. She could have called in Andy, Marc's young protege, to provide extra security, but it hadn't seemed necessary. Lorena would be coming in soon, after all. And later in the day, she'd booked the cleanup crew to come out and give the property some shine. There may be a tumult under the surface, but she sure wasn't going to give next week's group any hint of it, not if she could help it. She glanced over at Cooper's desk, a shiver running through her. It was a mess. As usual. So many empty coffee cups. He was obsessive about having a hot cup of joe at nearly all times, so much so that he kept a mini coffee maker under his desk. At least that had been cleaned up and put away by the janitor. Since bringing the group files to her desk, she had largely left Cooper's alone. Tasha released a deep breath. She pulled a file from the stack on her desk and opened it up to find an Excel spreadsheet listing campers' names. The group hailed from a private school in the Bay Area. Cheerleaders and halftime dancers were coming to the camp for some rest and relaxation after their regular football season had ended. Makeovers? Mobile mani-pedi stations? Tasha looked up. Pulling kids out of school for R&R. She flipped another look at the file. Camps at this time of year for students were usually educational in nature. The kids would hike and come back in from the trail dirty and hungry. The ranger would lead talks around the fire both in the morning and after the sun had set. She groaned. All she needed was to host a group of princesses who thought they needed some rest from the rigors of popularity. "Thought I'd find you here." "Oh." Tasha reacted with a snap of her knee against the underside of her desk. Wolfie whined, shifted, and settled back into his pillow. "You scared me." Tasha found Lorena standing in the doorway with a plate bearing 2 burnt orange-colored cupcakes. She kept rubbing her knee. "But if those are pumpkin spice, I'll forgive you." Lorena plunked the plate onto the one empty, small but empty, spot on Tasha's desk. "Of course they are." She gave the office a quick sweep of her eyes. "Shoot, what happened to this place?" "Files everywhere." Tasha released a sigh and sat back, her desk chair eliciting a squeak in protest. "I can't figure out what Cooper had been doing. I mean, the camp is booked, that's not the problem, but it's like he was marketing this place in a way that, well, I'm not exactly sure that we'll be able to live up to promises he made." Lorena thumbed through the files, her eyes not meeting Tasha's. "What's on your mind?" Lorena shrugged, continuing to thumb through the papers on Tasha's desk. "Nothing really. Lot of work to do. That's all." Tasha put her hand on the file that Lorena fiddled with. "Spill it." "Ah." Lorena flopped into a chair. I heard Beth and Cooper fighting about all this. He was pushing her to come up with all kinds of new programs. I think he wanted the camp to become some kind of go-to place for rich people's kids. What kind of programs? Oh, fancy cooking classes for one. She laughed suddenly, as if overtaken by a thought. He kept calling the cafeteria the bistro. Sounds like Cooper. Yeah. Beth told him to grow up though. Said something about not really wanting to be here, but him making her come and what? Lorena looked pensive but ultimately shook her head. Trying to remember, but I can't. Anyway, she seemed frustrated with him while he yacked on and on about holding dance lessons here in the off-season. This is the off-season. Well, sure, but Cooper just saw this place differently than the rest of us do. Tasha plucked a file from the bunch and flipped it open. She pulled a pink receipt from the stack. Guess that's why he spent more than $8,000 on an espresso maker. Lorena's mouth went slack, her eyes round. Isn't that nuts? I can't believe a coffee maker costs so much. Not just any coffee maker, mind you. This thing is commercial grade, imported from Italy. It's fabulous, but I wonder if the Adair brothers had approved a purchase like that. Tasha sighed and sat back. Actually, there are a dozen other receipts in here for expensive items. If I didn't know better, I'd think Cooper wanted to turn this place into some kind of spa. Yeah, she mused, pensive. Thinking about him? Lorena nodded. I didn't like him all that much, especially when he cut my hours, but I didn't wish him dead. I don't think any of us did. Well, somebody did. Unless, of course, he just fell off that old hill. But, I don't know, not many people have anything nice to say about him. Tasha pursed her lips and nodded. Beth groused about him, and the staff couldn't stand his theatrics, and shoot, even Eleanor complained to me about him running through her property and trampling all her flowers. Tasha laughed. What? She did. Well, when he was a kid he did that. She said he was a troublemaker even then. Okay, makes sense. She is in her 90s. Funny to think that she was already an adult when the Eaton and Adair kids were running amok in Cottage Grove. Tasha tapped her finger on the desk. Can you give me Beth's number? Lorena frowned. Why? Don't worry, I'm not asking her for cooking advice. I should hope not. But I think we should call her right now and offer her our condolences. Or have you already? Lorena gave her a guilty sigh. No. I haven't called her either, so you won't be finding any judgment here. Tasha picked up her cell phone. Maybe it's best that we handle this together. Tasha punched in the number Lorena provided and listened as it rang and rang, before going to voicemail. 4. That afternoon, after she had memorized every program detail for the group that would be arriving first thing Monday morning, and after having helped Lorena scour the camp kitchen, though it had not really needed quite the thoroughness that Lorena insisted on, Tasha collected a stack of files to bring home with her, shut off her office light, and locked the door. With Wolfie trotting along beside her, she began to head for her car but stopped. Sunset was another hour away yet, and poor Wolfie had not had exercise since this morning. Coincidentally, neither had she. She trudged over to her car, dumped the files in her purse, then turned toward the northwest end of camp. Come on, boy, she called, pushing away at the niggle of unease reminding her that Cooper had traveled in the same direction on the day he died. Of course he had strayed from the well-marked path for reasons that remained unknown. Tasha zipped her jacket to her chin, shutting out the brisk mountain air. If she and Wolfie stayed on the path, they could get in a nice hike before sunset. They would turn around at the fire pit that marked the end of camp, hopefully not bringing too much of the forest back home with them. Wolfie scampered along the trail, his nose moving faster than an aftershock. The changing of the seasons always brought out new smells for him to discover. With daylight shrinking ever still, Tasha had to work harder this time of year to give her pup plenty of outdoor time. Despite the shadow of questions that hung over them all, Tasha loved the blessed silence of this walk on a meandering path. The only sounds were hers and Wolfie's feet against the trail, the rustling of air beneath branches and leaves, and of course, occasional welcoming bursts from the sea. So when her cell phone began to vibrate in her coat pocket, Tasha's immediate reaction was to pitch it into a thicket without looking at the screen. Then again, it could be Marc, and she didn't want to worry him again. Besides, she could walk 2 feet and suddenly lose service.
Hello.
She didn't look at the caller's name on her screen, but instead kept her eyes focused on Wolfie, who had stopped to growl at a roly-poly, aka pillbug, that had flopped onto its back. Poor thing. Tasha, it's Beth. If a heart could plummet into one's stomach, this was no doubt how that might feel. Beth. I listened to your voicemail, and I'm returning your call. Her voice sounded flat, emotionless. Tasha scraped her toe in the flattened dirt of the path. Lorena and I had called to tell you how sorry we were to learn about Cooper's death. Yeah. Of course. It was tragic. Thank you. Although I'm not naive. I know my brother wasn't exactly beloved around camp, or anywhere in Cottage Grove. There will be no memorial. He had his idiosyncrasies. Don't we all? You could put it that way, I suppose. But my brother wasn't one of those people whose quirks made people love him. She didn't know how to answer that. Or even if she should try. How is your mother handling the news? Is there anything I can do for either one of you? Or for Parker? Mother is in mourning, but she will pull through. Parker's too young to understand what's happening, but thank you for caring. Of course. I won't be in for a while. So many arrangements to handle, even without a memorial to plan. It's hard to be here in his house without him here badgering me. This is all so hard. She paused. But I will try to make it in time for the party that Lorena cannot stop talking about. I would not want to let you all down. Oh, was it Tasha's place to let her know that Lorena had essentially taken over the running of the kitchen? Surely Beckett should be the one to deliver that news. Beck told me you agreed to run camp for a while. I was relieved to hear that. It's the least I could do. The cliché popped out of her mouth before she could think of anything more affirming to say. Take care, Tasha. And thank you for calling. I appreciate that, Beth continued, her voice faltering, more than you know. Tasha whispered bye and slid her phone back into her pocket, but her mind lingered on her brief conversation with Beth. The woman had only recently returned to Cottage Grove, and now the one who had brought her here was gone. Slowly, Tasha continued her walk. It was some time before she realized that Wolfie was not beside her. Wolfie. She called him once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. She sped her pace. Wolfie. Come on, boy. Still nothing. Tasha set her jaw. The sun had lowered significantly since she had set out on this little hike. Wolfie, come. This wasn't the plan, boy. It's time to go home, she called out. Tasha slowed to a stop and stood alone on the path, waiting. If she strained to listen, she might be able to pick up a sound pointing to where Wolfie had gone. She shut her eyes, willing her pup to appear before her on the trail. Come on, Wolfie. The crush of leaves pricked at her ears. The rustle of branches. Then nothing. She opened her eyes, but could not figure out the direction of the sounds. She strained again to listen for a sign. A crackle burst from the west. Wolfie. Tasha bounded toward the end of the path where the fire pit sat cold and empty. She looked right, then left, but no sign of her dog. She threw her head back and heaved a groan into the sky. What choice do I have? Reluctantly, Tasha stepped off the path and into the foliage and trees that had sprouted and grown unfettered by development. Minutes passed. The crash of surf from the nearby cliff grew louder. She kept moving, intent on finding Wolfie among the vegetation, much of it standing taller than her dog himself. Night was coming, so she patted her phone in her pocket, making sure it was secure. A flashlight would come in handy soon. A snap of dry branch caused her to spin around. Wolfie. What are you doing all the way out here? Tasha gasped and slapped a hand to her chest. Even through her coat, she could feel the rapid pounding of her heart. Wes? Don't you listen? I told you to stop snooping around, and here you are, at the scene of the crime. She drew in a breath to calm herself. First of all, I'm not snooping around. I'm looking for my dog. In the fading light, Tasha could see the doubt in Wes's eyes. And second, she glanced around, her eyes adjusting to her surroundings. Towering trees became an eerie framework when paired with a crime scene. Tasha lowered her voice to a whisper. I hadn't realized where I was, that this is where Cooper fell to his death. A thought passed across Wes's face, chipping at his stony expression. He didn't fall, Tasha. No. No.
How do you know?
A hunch. Tasha's shoulders relaxed slightly. Is it possible that maybe Cooper simply fell? I know I've said this before, but why freak everyone out with talk of murder when all it might have been was an accident? Because, and this is just between us, but we got a preliminary report back. He was poisoned, Tasha. No. You're sure? He nodded. We saw some signs, but had to wait for verification. What did they find? Wes's face took on that stony mask again. No need to get into all that. Tasha's back stiffened. For heaven's sake, you tell me the man was poisoned, but not what was found in his system? I hardly think you have any reason to hold back now. Wes sighed and rolled his eyes, as if she was his little sister, and she had worn him down with her incessant requests for a pack of Skittles. You're not gonna believe it. Try me.
Arsenic.
The tip-off was the meese lines on his fingernails, unmistakable. Good old arsenic had wound itself around his blood cells like shoelaces in a knot.
But how?
Who has access to arsenic? Is that even a thing anymore? Sure it is. The stuff's still used to preserve wood, in pesticides, even in ammunition. That narrows it down, she said, her voice thin. She shut her eyes at the news, her mind dizzy with the realization that Cooper was dead by poisoning. It was all too much to fathom. She glanced around for a stump to sit down on when she heard a familiar sound. Wolfie's tags. Tasha knew that jingle anywhere. Wolfie. At her call, Wolfie bounded toward her, as carefree as when he had disappeared. There you are. Tasha squatted to greet her naughty pet. Her hand froze when she caught sight of something hanging from Wolfie's mouth. What have you got there? She plucked a white styrofoam cup from the dog's mouth. Stop. Tasha looked up at Wes and held the cup out for him to see. It's just trash. Don't move your fingers. Hang on. She watched him wriggle his hands into a pair of black gloves. Then he reached for the cup, gingerly taking it from her fingers. He squatted so close she could see the laser-like focus of his eyes. What is it? What's got you so spooked? He glanced in her direction, then back at the torn and mottled cup that Wolfie had brought to her as a gift. It's evidence, Tasha, he said quietly, and if I were you, I'd let Lorena know not to leave town. What in the world does Lorena have to do with this? Don't know, really. But if what killed Cooper is found on this cup, and if she was the one who served it to him, she's going to have a lot of questions to answer. Speechless, Tasha took another look at the cup dangling from Cooper's hand, then back again at the officer's rather triumphant expression. And Tasha. Yes, she said, blinking rapidly. You're going to want to wash your hands as soon as possible. I wash my hands of this whole thing, Bain was saying, as Tasha passed below the open main camp window on the way back to her car. Wes had sped back to the station, taking the precarious evidence with him, talking about calling in forensics this weekend. Tasha had her doubts about the cup's helpfulness. Certainly investigators had combed the area previously and would have noticed something like an empty cup next to a body. Then again, Wolfie had more than once proved himself resourceful. She didn't want to think again about the time he had carried a dead 4-foot garden snake into her kitchen, as if it were a length of ribbon. Not taking any chances, Tasha had bundled Wolfie in her arms and carried him all the way back to camp where her car awaited. She had not expected to run across the brothers this evening. Well, you don't have to worry. Beth is not going to hold a memorial, so we won't have to pretend we liked the guy. I knew we shouldn't have hired him. Why'd I ever let you talk me into it? He was a jerk when we were kids, Vane said. Don't speak ill of the dead. Whoever made up that saying never met Cooper Eaton. Vane shot back. Wolfie tried to wiggle free, but Tasha pulled him in close. Unfortunately, she neglected to cover his mouth, and he whined his frustration into the night. Did you hear that? Beck said. Somebody out there? Vane's voice called out, as if he had moved closer to the open window. Tasha laid a gentle hand across Wolfie's muzzle and hurried away. When she reached the south end of main camp, where she had left her car, Beck was standing on the porch as if he had been waiting for her. Can I help you, Tasha? She spoke slowly, hoping she sounded calm. Hey, Beck. Vane came from around the other side of the building. You again? What are you doing here so late at night? Just tell the truth. I worked all day, gentlemen. I put the group files for the next couple of weeks in order, then helped Lorena scrub the kitchen so that we'll be ready for Monday's arrivals. That was during the day. Why are you skulking around here in the dark now? Vane said. After work, I decided to hike down the northwest path. My plan was to get back before sundown, but this little guy made doing that difficult. She flicked her chin toward Wolfie, who flashed a pair of puppy eyes that more than pleaded his innocence. Beck's eyes narrowed at her, his arms crossed in front of him. Vane blew out an exasperated breath. It's been a rough week, she finally said. For all of us. Guess I'd better be going. Beck leaned against a wooden post that framed the back porch. Hold on a second. She looked up at him, hoping her increasingly frayed nerves would not betray her. Yes? I understand you're the only one with a key to the office. I am. She is. Vane said. Other than Cooper's key, Beck said. And nobody seems to know where he might have left that. I wondered if, before you go, you could let me into the office. Vane groaned. I guarantee you won't find anything. My hunch is that guy stashed away as much of our money as he could, and probably other people's too. All that stress gave the guy a heart attack or something. Beck scowled at Vane. Stop with the theatrics. He unfolded his arms and turned again to Tasha. If you don't mind. It should only take a few minutes. Tasha nodded, still holding tight to Wolfie, who had become increasingly agitated. She knew, though, that if she let him down she may never get out of there tonight. There were too many stairs and crevices and rooms in the old place for her dog to resist further exploration. With a hint of trepidation, Tasha followed Beck up the back stairs into the mudroom, with Vane following close behind her. 5. So what happened next? Lorena asked as she dredged sliced apples and lemon for an enormous apple tart. It was Sunday, and Tasha had joined her in the camp kitchen because Lorena planned to bake several of the large tarts now so they would be on hand for hungry cheerleaders tomorrow. Tasha craned her neck for the umpteenth time, peering into the dining hall. She knew the Adair brothers were not on site, but still she kept watch. Nothing, but at the same time, something. That's dramatic. The entire experience gave me the creeps, for some reason. Why? Because you think they're up to something? She shrugged. No, not really. Although, well, it felt as if they didn't trust each other all of a sudden. I've heard that about those two. Like they're brothers from different mothers. Ha. Then again, they may have just been looking for Cooper's plans for the future. As I had thought, he wanted to turn this place into a leisure spa. Lorena looked up. Not right away, of course. But all the evidence is clear that he had big plans for the place. Lots of expensive purchases, squirreled away as if he was waiting for just the right time to kick out all the campers and welcome the rich and famous. What kind of rich and famous like to sleep in cabins with twin beds wrapped in bedbug covers? Right. She turned her chin toward Lorena. Maybe what I was feeling last night was their distrust of Cooper. Or maybe they just don't trust me. You. Why would you think a thing like that? Tasha shrugged. wishing she could tell Lorena what she'd learned from Wes last night about the mounting evidence that Cooper's death was not an accident. She didn't want to spook her friend, though she had to admit that she had been fairly skittish herself since learning this bit of news.
Well, never mind.
It was just a vibe. And maybe it's not me per se that they seem to be scrutinizing, but anyone who has had access to the behind-the-scenes workings in this place. Do you think they regret hiring Cooper? Neither of them came out and said that, but they did seem disappointed in their own way by all that's transpired. I mean, remember the big ribbon-cutting celebration they held here last summer? True, some of the locals were unhappy that they booted Pastor Rick out, but others seemed to think they were the answer to lack of available jobs in town. Like this place would suddenly be crawling with new opportunity now that they were all back. They do all have roots here. About that. I know that Bane and Beck's parents once ran this place. They owned it. What? I never heard that before. Lorena hesitated, one hand hovering in the air above a tray of thinly sliced apples on homemade dough. She shrugged, continuing to fan out the fruit. I think I heard that somewhere anyway. So wait, the Adair's parents owned this place but sold it. Was that when they were kids? Lorena didn't look up, but nodded. I don't really know the details. If that's not common knowledge, I probably shouldn't have said anything. She glanced over her shoulder. My job is already on thin ice here, so don't mention to anyone what I told you, okay? Tasha nodded solemnly. Being camp cook had been a lifeline for her friend, who soon after marrying learned that she could not conceive children. With her husband gone for days at a time, the camp had been the place where she could lovingly share her cooking and baking skills for guests of all ages. Tasha had noticed more than once the patience Lorena had shown with children when they'd been assigned to kitchen detail. She might have seemed gruff at times, barking orders when a particularly large and hungry group descended on camp, but her heart was golden. And the kids knew it. I'll keep it to myself if that's what you want. Lorena's chin bobbed. I do. Now let's talk about that dining hall. With the weather being so gray outside, I'm thinking it could use some brightening up. Any ideas? Maybe tablecloths? Tasha sighed. Believe it or not, I had just mentioned to Cooper that I thought the interior could use a nice bright paint job, and he had agreed. But that was before, well, you know. Yes, I know. I have an idea. Lorena looked up from the tray of apples that she had just doused with a mix of butter, cinnamon, and sugar. Let's ask Eleanor for some cuttings. I was over there the other day, and even at this time of year, she's got more flowers blooming than I saw all summer. We could put them in clear glass globes all around the room. Easy fix. Lorena frowned and looked away. Don't you think that sounds nice? I don't know, she finally said. From what I know, she is fond of her flowers. Let's not bother her. Bother her. I think it will help her make room for new blooms. Besides, I need an excuse to check on her. Did I tell you that she burned her trash the other night? Nearly scared Marc and me to death, thinking the meadow behind her house was on fire. Lorena shot a look up. She's home. I think so. You mean from her sister's place, right? Lorena dragged her eyes back to her work and shrugged. From wherever. I'd heard, around town that she traveled to see family a lot. Figured she might not be home right now. So does this mean you'll go with me? No. Tasha stared after Lorena for a second or two. If she didn't know better, she might think her friend was suffering from some sort of depression. Maybe the events of this week had taken their toll, and she was handling all of it, George's departure, Wes's curious questions, Cooper's inexplicable death, the best way she could. By cooking. Or in the case of this Sunday afternoon, by baking more trays of apple tarts than a group of princesses would likely consume. Will you be okay here, if I run over there for a little while? I promise to be back soon. Sure. I'll be fine. Here, Tasha said, placing the two-way radio on the counter near Lorena. If you need to get a hold of Andy, this is the best way. Suit yourself. I'll be back soon. Promise. Tasha drove over to Eleanor's place rather than walk the rocky and rutted path between properties. The walk would have been nice even in the cooler weather, but the load of flower cuttings she hoped to acquire would take more than 2 hands to bring them back to camp. That is, if Eleanor agreed to her request. The woman could be feisty. But she was approaching 100 years of life, so Tasha supposed she had earned the right to a little feistiness. As she made her way up the old woman's steps and stood in front of her screen door, Tasha realized something else. Eleanor may have seen something the day that Cooper died. Why hadn't she thought of that before? Had Eleanor returned from her sister's home in time to have noticed anything? Tasha tucked the questions in her memory bank and knocked on the door. Eleanor answered with paintbrush in one hand and a scowl on her face. "Hello, Eleanor. Have I bothered you?" Eleanor's face softened considerably. Heaven's number. I thought it was someone selling magazines again. Haven't those people ever heard of the internet? So much for Lorena's theory that Eleanor might not know her way around Facebook. Tasha laughed. "I can confidently say that I am not here to sell you magazines, or anything else for that matter. I do have a favor to ask though." "Of course. Come in, come in." She unlocked the screen and ushered Tasha into her tiny, cluttered living room. "I was just working on a chalk paint project. Redoing an old dresser. I almost never buy anything new, you know. Learned that from my Charlie. But of course, I'm sure you know that about me. Come into the kitchen and we'll have some sun tea." Tasha followed Eleanor into her kitchen, realizing that a faint smoky aroma remained from the recent trash burning. Her thoughts spun back to that night, when she and Marc had rushed toward the smell of smoke, fearful over what they might find. She remembered the smudge of dirt across Marc's cheek when he stepped through the doorway from the back porch, and how she had wanted to reach up and touch his skin when she'd noticed it. She wished he would hurry home. "Please sit down," Eleanor said, breaking through her reverie. She lowered herself into a vinyl chair in front of a slab of a table, its uneven wooden surface marred by years of use. Some might say the years gave it character. Tasha glanced around, noting how organized the kitchen was compared to the living room. The first time she'd been in this room last summer, she'd been given a tour of its somewhat eclectic appliances. A vintage stove that still worked, a yellow KitchenAid mixer she'd been offered grand sums of money for, and a mocha pot, which created real Italian coffee, as Eleanor had put it. She even had a tin herb mill stashed on the counter. "I had to leave this tea out all day yesterday since there was little sun. Oh, but you will love it," Eleanor said, fussing with the knob of a fat glass jug. "I added lemon from my trees. They drop lemons nearly year-round, you know. And I also added some basil. No one thinks to do this, and they really should." Tasha smiled. "Sounds delicious. I can't wait to try it." Eleanor poured them each a glass, put Tasha's in front of her, then sat down across from her. "Now," she said, "what kind of favor is it that you've come for?" "I was hoping for some fresh flowers to brighten up the camp dining hall. We're expecting a large group tomorrow, and it's a bit dismal in there right now." "Oh, I am not surprised that the camp has a pall to it right now. Have they learned more about what made Cooper fall?" Tasha shook her head. She hated lying, but the tale wasn't hers to tell. The police had not released any further news to the public, and until they did, she did not dare talk about the latest findings. "My, that's too bad. His poor sister. She was always such a waifish child, unlike her brother who was more like a bear, always bounding over hill and dale, God rest his soul." "That's right. I'd forgotten you might remember them from when they were young. I've lived in this house for nearly 70 years. Young Beth would come to me right like you are, and ask to take some flowers from my garden. She liked the daisies, would always run off with a bunch in her hands and one in her hair." "What was Cooper like?" Eleanor gave her a rueful, closed-mouth smile. "He was smart. He could read and do his multiplication tables. Recited them at every turn." She leaned forward. "I was a teacher's aide over at the school in those days. Yes, Cooper was smart but always so busy. Drove his teachers nuts." Tasha nodded. "I can see that. He always had an opinion, but said it like it was fact. I may be old, but I remember when Charlie would work on his old truck in the driveway. He always came in shaking his head after a visit from young Cooper. That boy has an answer for everything, my Charlie would always say. Seems Cooper would learn something new and just run around with it like he was an authority on the topic. She shifted in her seat and took another sip of tea. That sort of thing can get on people's nerves sometimes. I suppose it can. Is that what happened? Had Cooper spouted off one too many times until it was too late? He trampled my garden more than once. I'm ashamed when I think of the times I raised my voice at him, as if plants were more important than people. Those Adair brothers got a load of my bellowing too sometimes. You're too hard on yourself. Nonsense. I should not have been so grumpy. The flowers always grow back, you know. Anyway, Beckett and Bain were good kids. Always so helpful. Their mother was lovely, she died very young, you know. Tasha shook her head. I didn't know. Eleanor looked into the rafters, as if doing so would help to crystallize memories from long ago. So sweet, that one. Would dress the boys up as twins, and bring them by my fence to admire the flowers. They aren't twins, of course, but they always looked so dapper in their matching clothes. What happened to her? Eleanor frowned. Cancer. Just like my Charlie. Terrible disease. She released a sigh and continued. After she died, the boys kept busy. They were hard workers, always helping their dad with projects around the camp. Such a sad time when they lost it so soon after their mother passed away. Lost it? You mean the camp? Oh yes. Now, this isn't for the public's ears. People confide their secrets to me all the time, but this information is hardly news anymore. Their father had a gambling problem and had run up debts. I heard it from the bookkeeper up at the church. The church bailed them out, you know. I had no idea. Is that how Pastor Rick came to run the camp? She puckered and squinted at the ceiling, then began to nod. As I recall, someone from the church did run the place, but eventually, Pastor Rick took over. He did a nice job, although some say that his daughter running off with a Wrangler last year turned some folks against him. She shrugged. But life is not as simple as we sometimes try to paint it. Tasha thought about her own wretched love life, and how she wouldn't be here in this beautiful town if her fiancé had not left her at the altar. True, he could have ended their relationship in a less spectacular fashion, but in the end she was grateful, for she had found a new home, friends, and love with her cowboy. Eleanor peered at Tasha. Now listen to me, walking down memory lane like that. I've kept you. Not at all, Eleanor. I always enjoy your company. I have a question for you, though. Did you happen to see Cooper on the morning that he died? Were you back in town by then? I'm afraid I was not. You see, I was supposed to return, but my brother-in-law's truck had a problem again, so I had to wait until the next afternoon. I understand. Now you go ahead and take any flowers you like. I have a bucket in my bathroom that you can use. I always leave one in there to collect the cold water while it heats before my bath, but it's empty right now. And there are a couple in my shed out back that you can take too. Sure you don't mind if I take them? Eleanor swiped a hand in front of her face. Not at all. You go ahead and gather your flowers. She pushed herself up slowly from the table. I have a dresser to finish painting. Back at camp, Tasha unloaded the last of the flower buckets from her car and shut the hatchback. That's when he grabbed her at the waist and spun her around. Marc, she said before he silenced her with a firm kiss on the mouth. She pulled back, laughing, the taste of him still on her lips. You scared me to death. He leaned in, touching his forehead to hers. Sorry, he whispered. Didn't mean to scare you, but you're just too irresistible. You know that? She quirked a smile at him. You keep saying that. What, you don't believe me? She pulled back again, but not before giving his stubbly cheek a brush of her hand. You're good for my ego, Mr. Shepherd. That's mighty formal of you, Ms. McHenry. Seems as if we need to be spending more time together, though. Now there's something I can agree with. He glanced at the buckets of flowers by her feet. Did you leave anything behind for Eleanor to burn? Tasha cracked up. Stop it. These are for the dining hall, she said with a flick of her chin toward main camp. Lorena thought it could use some cheer. He nodded. I know. Listen, it's going to need a lot more cheer in there than you think. One of her brows lifted. You heard something? Marc sighed and slipped an arm around her, glancing toward the sky where pine trees swayed on the slight breeze.
Same thing you heard, beautiful.
She gazed up at him, waiting. I know you heard that Cooper was likely poisoned with arsenic. I called Wes for an update. At first he wouldn't tell me anything, but eventually I got it out of him. Really? And how did you go about doing that? He searched her face. Told him I was worried about you, that you'd been snooping around, and that if he didn't figure out what happened soon, Tasha McHenry might scoop him and go running to the papers with all she knew. And how would that look? She gasped. No, you didn't. I figured that his ego would trip him up, and he would have no choice but to tell me about his latest findings, but I learned something else, something that should not have surprised me. What's that? He's got it bad for you. Tasha scoffed and pulled away from Marc. He does not have a thing for me. The truth is, I didn't threaten that you would go to the newspaper, but I did warn him that you might take things into your own hands. He said no and nearly cried. Stop it. And then he swore at me. Tasha turned and glared at Marc. Marc chuckled. Don't look so shocked, you're a desirable woman, you know. And your boyfriend spends too much time away from you. I'm going to amend that, by the way. She scooped up a bucket, avoiding its jagged handle, likely worn sharp by the years. She hugged it against her middle. You're making me feel like a piece of meat. And none of this is true anyway. She walked ahead of him toward the hall, calling back over her shoulder, but I'm in agreement that my boyfriend needs to spend more time with me. He sidled up to her, the other two buckets in his arms, his voice deepening a notch. That's exactly what I plan to do starting now. She stopped. How can you? I hired a foreman and spent the weekend training him on the specifics of the project. Should have done that earlier, but I guess I didn't want to give up control. He swept over her face with a look that told her he had thought deeply about this. But then I realized that there are some things or someone more important than my need to be a constant presence at the site. I don't know what to say. That project means so much to you, you worked so hard to get it. Are you sure? Yes, ma'am. I'm positive. She smiled at the formality. He'd used that term more than once when they'd first met, back when she regularly displayed her dislike of him and his presence in her neighborhood. A tickle of that memory pulled at her cheeks. That hadn't lasted long. Not at all. They reached the back steps when Marc stopped at the sound of a car pulling into the lot. A silver Mercedes sedan pulled up between her unwashed hatchback and Marc's work truck. Beth, Tasha whispered. Beth Eaton, dressed in black leggings and a flowing black blouse, stepped out of the car, her mouth grim. When she reached them, Tasha simply said, Beth. Marc reached out and placed one hand on her shoulder. I'm sorry about your brother. She nodded, her blue eyes watery. Thank you. I've just come to collect some of his things. I don't suppose his office is open, though. No problem. I have a key, Tasha said, making a mental note to have a copy made soon. Could I talk to you a minute first? Marc nodded once at the women. I'll go on in with the flowers and leave them in the hall. When he'd left, Beth asked, Is Beck here? Tasha shook her head. I don't think so. He wasn't here earlier, but I left for a bit. Oh. Tasha tilted her head, seeing a woman whose every nerve seemed to have frayed overnight. Deep gouges had formed at the corners of Beth's eyes. Is there anything I can pass along to him for you? She asked. I'll be here all day tomorrow, so I might see him then. She shook her head, her mouth a flat line, the color in her face deepening. No. It's not something, no. She lifted her chin again. I would like to see inside my brother's office, though. Of course. The women entered the main office area through a door at the end of the mudroom, managing to skirt both the kitchen and Lorena in the process. No sense stirring up the flimsy pact that the two women had made, although Tasha sensed that, in light of the circumstances, Lorena would have taken pains to keep the peace if they had happened upon each other. On their way through the dining hall, they passed Marc, his knees bent to the floor as he adeptly built a fire in the fireplace. That, too, would warm up the camp, both figuratively and literally. The office appeared to be in the same disarray that it was the other night when Beck asked her to let him in. Usually she only worked in one small corner of the office, and had always cleared off her desk at the end of each day. But Cooper's desk always looked as if a gardener had just run a leaf blower over it, its files and papers and doodads of crystal and brass in disarray. The man wasn't much for filing, but he did usually drop the paperwork she needed onto her desk. She noted with some trepidation that she would likely have to scale and tame that mountain of paperwork on his desk sometime in the near future. Beth walked toward Cooper's desk, her movements slow, deliberate. A trickle of a tear slid down her cheek. She ran a finger across the cabinet door above the desk, stopping at the brass nameplate he had insisted on mounting there. She released a sigh. Gently, she moved to the pile of papers and files strewn across the top of the desk. She picked up a file, then another, restacking them as she went. Beth sniffled as she worked, but otherwise kept to herself. "Are you okay?" She shrugged. "I was just thinking about the last time I talked to Cooper. I wish we hadn't been so ugly to each other, especially with him not feeling well then." Tasha bit the inside of her bottom lip. "Just a spat between siblings, but I wish it wasn't the last thing I remember." A ripple of a sigh escaped her, the kind that comes after a good long cry. "Anyway, I guess I'd better keep looking." "Can I help you find anything?" Tasha finally said. Beth froze. It's embarrassing." "I won't laugh." Beth pulled in a harsh breath through her nose, evidence of spent tears. "I know you and your pal Lorena think that my life is easy." "I'm not sure why you would say that," Tasha said. "I mean, you work full-time and you have a child to raise on your own. Neither of those things would I call easy." Beth nodded, swallowing back her emotions. "Thank you. It's just, my brother helped me out regularly. It wasn't much, trust me. But each week, after he handed me my paycheck, he gave me a $50 bill as well. And now?" Tasha waited, willing the bereft woman to speak. Beth finally snagged Tasha's eyes with her own. "Now it would be really helpful if I could have an advance on my paycheck. I know that's not your responsibility, but I need the help." "Oh," Tasha said with a start. "You don't believe me. I can tell." "That's not true." "Well, not exactly. Culinary school was expensive and I'm still paying for my loans. This job was supposed to help with that, with so many things." Her voice trailed off until she corralled it back in. "Cooper only had a little bit of insurance, just enough to cover burial expenses." Her voice faltered on the words. "But I don't even have enough to buy groceries through the week. And taking off last week to deal with Cooper's passing. Regardless, it did not help my financial situation. Can you help me out?" The suddenness in which she delivered her request did not surprise Tasha as much as the request itself. Beth, who wore leather mozos in the kitchen seemingly without worry over how much chicken grease might get splashed across them, needed money. She'd come here soon after Cooper's arrival, driving a nice car and tossing out fancy French culinary terms, such as coquilles and foie gras, as if the townspeople of Cottage Grove had been looking for her skills all of their lives. Apparently, though, she had been playing a part in Cooper's show. Not that she wasn't a culinary whiz, she was. There was no shame in working hard to take care of your family, even when that often meant having little left over. But what about the damage that upholding a false image could do to those around a person? To those trying to keep up, but who ended up feeling like garbage when they couldn't. People like Lorena, who had given years to this camp, and to the children who came here year after year, only to be shoved into a corner and replaced by someone with highbrow ideas and little follow-through. Though that last part was probably more of Cooper's doing than Beth's. It was uncomfortable, this casting aspersions on someone who had passed away, but the man could spin a story, sell it to everyone within shouting distance, then move on to the next target. She had noticed this while taking a quick inventory of the receipt file. Some items had made an appearance, especially gadgets for the kitchen, but the location of others was a mystery. A bigger mystery was what they would do with them once all the deliveries began. Above-ground spa. New wood chipper? She thought the old one was working just fine. Spa products, shampoo, conditioner, and essential oils. And on and on. Heat filled Tasha's cheeks and she looked away. How could she fixate on bookkeeping issues at a time like this? Cooper was dead and his little sister, despite her image, was in need. No wonder Beth had been looking for Beck. He was a good guy. No doubt he knew the predicament Beth had found herself in and would likely help her. Beth cut into Tasha's thoughts. Forget it. I've put you in a terrible position. Please don't say anything to anyone else, okay? The woman had lost her brother suddenly and suspiciously, though she might not be aware of that last part yet. And she had a young child to feed, and maybe a mother to help as well. But she worked hard, and despite the way her presence caused waves of discontent throughout the camp, Tasha believed at this moment that it wasn't her fault. For some reason, Cooper had brought her in, along with lofty goals that would never come to fruition. And now Beth was standing here, holding a bag that he had left behind. One that was full of holes. Her heart ached at all that had been dumped on Beth. Here. Tasha thrust a $20 bill into the camp chef's hand. To tide you over until Beck shows up, and we can get that paycheck for you. Beth shook her head. No. I can't take this. But Tasha pressed the bill into her hand. You can and you will. It's not enough to buy more than a dinner or two, but it's what I have and it's yours. No more discussion. Beth's forehead bunched and her chin began to quiver again. Thank you so much. Tasha nodded once, anger rising up. You're welcome. 6. The next morning, Tasha pasted a smile on her face and headed outside with a clipboard in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. Though she felt certain that Cooper's death was likely an isolated incident brought on by bad behavior, and though she would not wish that on him, she still believed that the camp was safe. Very safe. Otherwise, they would have cancelled all groups through the rest of the month. Still, because of the impending presence of campers, most of whom had probably not ventured very far from the mall, let alone the wilderness, she had insisted on taking precautions and had hired several security guards to keep watch through the night. They would be starting this evening, and until then, she had Andy to help her. She had met young Andy under tense circumstances the year prior, but he'd come around about her, and frankly, she grew to love him too. Tasha watched as a caravan of Range Rovers pulled in and parked. Several women with smooth ponytails climbed out of the vehicles, athleisure fitted to their slim figures, while 16 teenage girls spilled out after them. The older women opened up the tailgate of each SUV, revealing supplies for the group's 3-night stay. Not a nondescript black duffel bag in the bunch. Instead, piles of shiny, colorful luggage jostled for attention as if waiting for concert doors to open. The women looked around, and then at each other. As Tasha approached the women, one called out, "Where is the bell service?" Tasha set the coffee cup she was holding on a nearby picnic table, and held up her clipboard. "I can help." She pierced the air with a whistle, catching the attention of her security/ranger for the day. "Andy, please come over and help our guests unpack their cars." She backed up a step and addressed the group. "Welcome to Camp Cottage Grove, everyone. We're glad you're here. Andy will help hand out your luggage. Anything that you cannot carry on your own, he can load on a cart and bring out to you. Sound good?" The women murmured, some squinting as if perhaps they hadn't heard correctly, while a few others wore expressions of resignation. She received hardly any response at all from the girls, who had, not surprisingly, split into several groups, young, younger, youngest. Tasha turned to one of the women who stood out, the one with the soft smile and bright eyes. "I'm Tasha, and you are?" "Grace." "Happy to meet you, Grace. I have your cabin assignments here," she said, tapping her clipboard. If I could run down the list with you and do a roll call, then I can give you your keys and send you on your way to a great getaway.
Wonderful.
I'm so happy to be here. She inhaled deeply. Even the smell is overwhelming. So clean compared to the city. Tasha smiled, but her heart ached at the lingering tragedy in their midst. Still, she was pleased and somewhat relieved to know that the group had brought along at least one nature lover. Together, Grace and Tasha worked through the list, checking off the name of each camper. The oblivious chatter of girls filled the otherwise quiet mountainside, their thumbs working over their smartphones. Some stopped to take selfies or groupies with selfie sticks, not concerned with either the state of their luggage or the maximum capacity of a selfie shot. For the most part, the girls traveled in swarms. Fortunately, except for food and nature hikes, this group had decided to self-host, meaning they would be providing their own spa leaders. Tasha's main objective was to serve the group well, but from afar. Too much mental disruption lately to have energy for much else. She tried not to think about the mayhem that could arise when the girls learned that Wi-Fi was nearly non-existent in and around the cabins. Tasha handed Grace the final key. Lunch is in an hour, so if any questions arise, you'll find me in the dining hall. What are we having? Piped up one of the teens. Tasha glanced at her clipboard, her mind a blank. It says here liver and onions. She looked up. Are we all good with that? Every member of the group went silent except for Grace, whose laughter bubbled over like pink champagne. I knew I liked you, Grace, you can see right through me already, Tasha said, the first real smile on her face all morning. The menu for lunch will be baked macaroni and cheese, fruit salad, and Lorena's homemade pumpkin muffins. You'll love it. Oh, that sounds divine, said one of the women in velvety activewear. After the group had finally left to settle in, Tasha headed for her office to drop off her clipboard and grab her plush zippered jacket. Clouds had begun blowing in, she had noticed, covering up sunshine that had been hazy at best. But as she dropped the clipboard onto her desk, she paused. That's strange. Peeking out from beneath a stack of files was the orange Christmas party file that she had been searching for days earlier. Where did you come from? She pulled the file out of the stack and flipped it open, settling into her chair. Her eyes scanned the spreadsheet of names and addresses, going through them each one by one, all of them people she knew or had met. Nothing appeared to be amiss. Then, why did the file's sudden appearance gnaw at the pit of her stomach? She glanced again at the list, running her forefinger down the page, mentally accounting for all of the regulars who attended the annual Christmas party, especially those whose property bordered the camp. Eleanor. Eleanor's name and address was missing. She looked again, whispering the name of each invitee, thinking maybe she had missed Eleanor's name the first time. But she hadn't. Eleanor Gerbassi's name was nowhere on the list, but how could that be? She had lived here longer than anyone. Tasha sighed, tossing the closed file onto her desk and collapsing against the back of her desk chair. Tasha. Tasha threw a look over her shoulder and winced at the spasm that occurred at the base of her neck. It was Andy. I think you'd better come outside right now. You look upset. He licked his lips. It's just that, well, Wes is here. Inwardly, she groaned. She did not have time for Officer Wesley today. Just send him in here, okay? I tried, but he's setting up outside. Has a reporter with him. Camera guy too. Tasha jumped up from her chair. What? No. Didn't you tell him we have a group on site today? She grabbed her jacket from the coat rack. Never mind. This isn't your problem. Just show me where he is, okay? Tasha, with Andy in tow, met Wes and his mini media circus outside on the north end of the property. Sure enough, a cameraman was setting up. Next to him stood a woman with neat short hair wearing a somber black pantsuit. A cream-colored blouse peeked from beneath her blazer. She spied Tasha right away and gave her a veiled smile. Though this spot was a long hike away from the spot where Cooper fell, Tasha felt certain that Wes had chosen it for its spitting distance. A person could feel quite small standing in front of the scene, and using it as a backdrop would no doubt give viewers a sense of the area's beauty, but also its vastness. The thought made Tasha shudder, but she pushed through it knowing she had a job to do. She crossed her arms in front of her. Kind of dramatic, don't you think, Wes? He gouged her with his gaze. So maybe she had stepped a toe over the line between the law and friendship, but shouldn't he have called first? Was showing up here with a reporter and cameraman even legal? I have an important announcement to make, Tasha. And if we're going to find our perpetrator, we're going to need the public's help. I understand, but this is not a good time. We have a group of young women in camp today, and there is no need to ruin their stay with tragic announcements. Somehow, I think what we're doing here is more important than showing kids how to roll up a sleeping bag. The cameraman backed into her, but she would not budge, despite the scowl on the man's bespectacled face. Andy jumped in front of the man, his arm outstretched in front of Tasha. Hey! Watch it! Tasha swiveled around at the sound of happy voices in the distance. The girls had settled in, it seemed, and were heading out to explore. Andy, Tasha whispered, gesturing with her eyes toward the cabins, why don't you go over to the parking lot and keep an eye out in case any of the women have questions? And leave you here. I'll be fine. She put her hand out. Wait a second. Do me a favor and bring the golf cart back here, and then you can go help our guests. He frowned again at the cameraman, then nodded toward Tasha and began to walk toward the lot where his cart was parked. Tasha turned back to Wes. If you really want to give your viewers a sense of what happened, then I suggest you hold your interview close to the cliff. Not here where you'll scare the heck out of some young girls and for no good reason. She set her jaw. Andy will be back in a second with the cart. I'll drive you to the end of the path. Minutes later, Officer Wes and his media crew had loaded themselves and their gear onto the golf cart. As they did, Tasha shot a quick text to Beck letting him know where he and Bane could find them, should they care to. She tossed a look over her shoulder to find the cameraman, a camera bag nestled between his feet, cradling the camera itself like a newborn in his arms. Andy leaned one straggly arm against the roof of the cart. Sure you don't want me to drive him out there? She shook her head. She needed to know what they were going to be reporting before everyone else did, and this was the best way she could think of to make that happen. I'll be fine. I plan to be back for lunch, but if not, tell Lorena to hold back some mac and cheese for me. Andy slapped the roof and stepped back as she drove off. When they arrived at the end of the path, she pulled up next to the fire pit and stopped the cart. We'll have to walk out from here, she said. Both Wes and the cameraman, whose name she had learned on the ride over was Scott, hopped out. The reporter leaned forward from the back seat. My name's Anita, she said. I would love to interview you after Officer Wes's announcement, if you're willing. She said it nicely enough, but Tasha didn't care to be interviewed. She didn't care to be here at all, and dealing with something so ugly after her own brush with crime a year before. Cottage Grove was to be her haven, and in so many ways it had been exactly that. But not today. Or this past week. She shook her head at the reporter. Sorry. I won't be giving any interviews. I understand. I'll leave you my card just in case. She dropped her business card on the front seat of the cart before stepping out to follow Wes and Scott. Tasha blew out a breath, realizing that tension had invaded her shoulders like a relentless telemarketer on a Sunday morning. She glanced at the card and slipped it into her pocket before heading off toward the cliff to watch Wes's big announcement. For all the fuss that Wes's unannounced presence had caused, it took just 3 minutes to film, and Tasha had not learned anything more than what she had already heard. Cooper had high doses of arsenic in his bloodstream. She glanced over at her bosses, who had arrived several minutes earlier. Beck watched Wes's big announcement being filmed, his stance and the line of his mouth equally rigid. Bane, for his part, paced. Neither one was pleased, yet what could they do? A crime had been committed, this the police knew. But what, Tasha wondered, were the results from the cup? I hope the next time you decide to hold a little conference on our property, you call and ask permission first, Bane said after the media had left. Wes just smiled and doffed his hat. No promises. Beck unfolded his crossed arms, allowing them to fall at his sides. Who in the world would have killed our camp director? It's ludicrous. Bane scowled. Not so ludicrous. I heard he was making all kinds of people mad. Have you seen payroll lately? All those long-timers quit, and we're having to pay out all kinds of money to contract workers. That ain't cheap. Speaking of your staff, Wes said, I need to bring Lorena to the station for questioning. All three of them, Tasha, Beck, and Bane, drew back. Bane curled his lip. What for? She can't go right now, Wes, Tasha said, her heart thumping painfully. She's just getting lunch on for our campers. Maybe I can help you. Wes tilted his head, his mouth grim. We have found evidence of how Cooper was poisoned. How? Bane asked. Wait, hold on, Beck said. If that's the case, why didn't you include that in your announcement? Because I do the investigating around here. Got that? Wes? Tasha said. Wes righted his shoulders and began striding toward main camp. Tasha sprang forth, following closely at his heels. Don't do this right now, Wes. I'm serious. She's very busy and cannot leave right now. This can't wait. It will have to. Wes, please. He stopped short, wavering. Wes crooked a look over one shoulder, then turned completely around to face Tasha. All right. For you, I will wait. He kept his gaze on her seconds longer than felt comfortable, let alone socially acceptable. She sensed Beck and Bane holding back, yet still behind her. Tasha pressed her lips together, hoping Wes would say more about what he needed from Lorena, but when he didn't, she thought she understood. The cup had tested positive for arsenic, and Wes believed that Lorena might know something about how that could occur. Tasha glanced at the ground, sick to her stomach. I'll tell her to go to the station, after lunch. She darted a look up. And to bring a lawyer with her. I agree with that, Beck said. And I second it, Bane chimed in. Further, you make sure that you call one of us before you go snooping around our property. Understand? Wes doffed his hat at Tasha, then smirked at the Adair brothers. Gentlemen. In silence, they watched him walk away. I don't like that guy, Bane said after he'd gone. What do you think he wants with Lorena? I mean, she hardly works that much around here now that Beth is in charge. Beth. With all the craziness, she had momentarily forgotten about the woman's plight. Beck, Tasha said, Beth was here last night hoping to talk to you. Bane shifted. Why'd she want to talk to him? Beck put one hand into the front pocket of his jeans and watched her thoughtfully. Well, she could use some help. Tasha sighed. Apparently Cooper helped her financially, and now that he is gone, she's in a tough place. She was hoping you would give her an advance on her paycheck. How much of an advance? Beck asked. Bane turned a surprised look on his brother. Of course she can have an advance. Whatever she wants. Beck gave his brother a settled-down look. He glanced back at Tasha. That was not a hesitation on my part. I only wanted specifics. I understand, and honestly, I didn't ask for that information. I guess I thought that maybe a week or two would suffice for now, but... Bane cut in. I'll call her. Beck nodded. Sure. Call her and ask her if there's anything else we can do for her. Once you hear what she needs, let Tasha know so she can cut the check. I'll be around camp through the end of the day to sign it. Tasha's shoulders relaxed. Great. Thanks. With some relief, Tasha turned toward main camp, determined to walk into the dining hall with a relaxed smile on her face, as if 100 thoughts weren't duking it out in her head. But as she climbed the back steps toward the mudroom, she remembered. She had promised Wes to send Lorena to the station for questioning. How was she supposed to tell her friend that? 7. Lorena stood on the back porch of main cabin, wringing her hands and looking as though she also wanted to wring someone's neck. What does that man want with me? I told him everything I know. I'm sure it's just a formality. Did you ask your neighbor Jeff to represent you? Lorena mouthed the words, represent me, as if the phrase itself was too heinous to say out loud. Lorena. She nodded. Yes, yes, my friendly neighborhood lawyer will be there. She wagged her head for the umpteenth time. They really found arsenic in one of our cups. Wes didn't come out and actually say that, but we both knew what Wolfie had found and that it had to be tested, Tasha said. He gave me a look, like we both knew the same thing. But I think he didn't want to say anything in front of the guys until he'd had a chance to speak to you. Lorena leaned her head to one side in a question. Since you were always experimenting with the coffee. She folded her arms in front of her. I was only trying to get into that man's good graces. Ah, Lorena. I know that, we all do. It's so awful, Lorena said. To think someone killed our boss. Yeah. Tasha approached the subject gently. Are you sure you don't have some kind of alibi for that morning? I mean, where were you going? Maybe somebody saw you. Lorena shook her head with a fierceness that told Tasha her answer was swift, firm, and final. Tasha pursed her lips and looked out toward the treetops that surrounded the camp. A picture-perfect day had emerged after the initial clouds that had been blowing around, causing pockets of extra cool weather. I'll try to be here before dinner, Lorena said, drawing Tasha back. Her expression showed how unlikely she thought that would be. Don't worry about dinner. I've already texted Marc and he and his crew will be up soon with all the fixins for the grill, chicken, steaks, even some veggies. I already have my eyes on those beans you made for tomorrow. Lorena nodded, her eyes distracted. Good. That's good. Tasha grabbed her friend's hands. Listen, don't say anything without your lawyer present, understand? We're going to get to the bottom of this, I promise you. Just don't. Don't what? Don't do or say anything to make Wes mad, okay? And, if at all possible, try to find an alibi. As predicted, Tasha was left to fend for herself that evening. Well, not alone, exactly. Marc's crew had shown up as promised. It was too late to fire up the smoker, so instead, they pulled the barbecue trailer out to a spot behind the kitchen and started the coals. Andy was her runner, i.e., he made constant trips from the kitchen to the trailer to the pantry to the overflow storage closet by the offices and back to the trailer. He's been a great help to me, Tasha said to Marc when they'd found a quiet moment behind the shed where some of the grilling tools were kept. He's come a long way from that angry boy who didn't trust you much. It's gratifying to see how much he's grown. I'll say. He's a man now, really. Speaking of being a man. Marc pulled her close, their noses bumping. He had worn his black Stetson today, charming her more than ever. She breathed him in. You smell delicious. Must be all that smoky goodness you're cooking up. That's my regular smell, darlin'. He leaned in for a kiss, and she delighted in every moment of his touch. Regretfully, she pulled away. Not exactly the alone time I was hoping for after you hired that foreman, but I'll take it. He stroked the bridge of her nose with his finger. It's going to calm down soon. Trust me. She frowned. Some of your boys aren't all that crazy about being here tonight. He gave his head a slow shake. Sorry you heard their grumbling. It's nothing to do with you, they love you, you know. Has more to do with their feelings toward the new owners, and how they treated Pastor Rick. He's been a friend and mentor to so many of them. Pretty sweet of them to be so loyal. Yes, well, they'll come around, especially after they get a look at some of your guests. She laughed. After lunch, the girls spent the rest of the afternoon getting Manus and Petties in their cabins. Definitely a first, but at least they were too preoccupied to notice the drama that Wes caused. Well, he didn't exactly cause the drama. That, unfortunately, was the work of someone who remains elusive. Tasha hung her head, the truth still so unbelievable. Yeah. I just meant that Wes didn't have to stir things up as he did. She shrugged, pulling her gaze back to Marc. Then again, what do I know about police work? Marc caressed her face with his hand. Not enough to get yourself wrapped up in it, I hope. No more taking Wolfie for late-night walks in the woods or anything else that could put you in imminent danger. Promise me. Tasha lifted herself up on tiptoes and kissed her cowboy on the chin. Promise. 8. I've never been so scared in all my life, Lorena said for the second time that morning. Her hand shook as she brought the coffee cup to her lips. She'd been downing caffeine since early morning, and she didn't even like the stuff. The scene was eerily reminiscent of Cooper and his zealousness toward a beverage that made him more jittery than a cat with a bell tied to his tail. Tasha gently pulled the cup from Lorena's shaking hands and set it into the sink. She reached for a pitcher of water, poured some into a paper cup, and handed it to her friend, whose red and droopy eyes told her that Lorena had not slept much the night before. If at all. Tasha cleared her throat. What did George say about all this? Lorena swallowed the water, but didn't meet Tasha's gaze. He wasn't with me. What? No, Lorena. He should have been with you. She pinned the cook with a stare. You did tell him, didn't you?
Yes and no.
He was sent out on a fire, not a big one, but I didn't want him to have to be called back to deal with this. Jeff and I talked it over and decided that we could handle it together and that he could fill George in later. I see. Lorena plunked the cup down onto the counter and water splashed out. Don't get all condescending with me. I just didn't want my poor husband to have to lie for me. If the police questioned him, he would have to either say that he had no idea where I was that morning, which is true, or he'd have to lie to protect me. And I did not want to put the best man I've ever known in that position. I thought you said you went out for a walk. I don't think him having to say that would be such a big thing, do you? Lorena grabbed a towel and dried the counter where she'd spilled water. Except that I never go on walks alone in the morning, well, hardly ever. George would know he'd be asked how often I took walks like that, and when he answered rarely, that might raise suspicion. And so he might feel like he should lie so that I don't get in trouble. So where exactly did you go that morning? Lorena put some elbow grease into her counter drying until not even a spot of mist could survive. Nowhere. Why won't you just tell me? The camp cook straightened, her eyes ablaze. She pitched the towel into the sink. Right now I have pancake batter to mix, eggs to crack, and 6 pounds of bacon to fry. And I'd like to get started on all that now. Alone. She made a sweep gesture with her fingers, letting Tasha know she wasn't invited to the morning's cook-a-thon. Tasha turned up both hands in a sign of surrender. She started for the door, intending to look over the day's schedule. I'm sorry if you think I'm harassing you, friend. I'm just worried. That's all it is. Lorena had already pulled the eggs from the fridge and had begun cracking them into a bowl. She nodded without looking up. I know, she said quietly. Instead of heading into her office, Tasha went through the mudroom to go outside and get some fresh air. She breathed in deeply and pulled her elbows back as far as she could, allowing oxygen to fill her lungs. As she let it out, she spotted Eleanor's buckets stacked up next to the steps. She smiled, thinking about the resourceful nonagenarian and the way she did her part to save every precious drop of the drought-stricken state's resources. Poor Eleanor had been without her buckets for days, so she bent to scoop them up, careful to avoid the sharp edge of one of the handles. She checked her phone and decided to take the long walk toward Eleanor's little home outside of camp. If she walked fast, she could be back to camp in plenty of time for the day's activities to get underway. The dirt path, strewn with pine needles and framed by ferns and other types of evergreen foliage, reminded her of the path to the secret garden that she'd read about in a book as a child. So much to imagine as she walked freely past the bare but cozy cabins and into the ever-changing woods. Few wildflowers, such as the lupine she loved, would be blooming at this time of year, but in their place came the burnished color of fall as it slipped into winter.
Oh no!
Tasha turned her ear toward the young girl's voice, her eyes searching beyond the trees. My new nails, the girl cried out. I can't believe one broke already. Another girl bounded over and through low-growing vegetation. She picked up a volleyball that had landed in a bush, then peered at the other girl's hand. That sucks. Why'd you throw it so hard? The first girl grumbled. That was nothing. The girl with the broken nail stood with her shoulders hunched, her straight blonde hair curtaining her face. Tasha recognized her as one of the seniors. "I hate wasting money," she lamented. "Maybe someone could fix it?" The blonde clucked her tongue. "I doubt anyone around here would even care." Once Tasha established from afar that neither girl required medical attention, she picked her pace back up. A lizard scurried ahead of her, stopped, then hurried on as if to say, "Come on, it's this way." She continued to walk along through the woods, slowing only when she came upon the divot-marked surface that had once been an easy pass-through road to the neighbors. Carefully, she walked around the ruts and holes until she saw Eleanor's house in the clearing. Eager to get back to camp, she jogged up the porch and knocked on the door. "I'm right here." Tasha let out a knee-jerk scream. She yanked a look at the porch, finding Eleanor in her rocking chair, sipping something translucent green through a straw. "Oh dear," Eleanor said. "I startled you." "And I think I startled you too." Tasha let out a nervous little laugh, still trying to catch her breath. "Wow. Okay." She laughed again. "I have to get back to camp soon, but I wanted to return these buckets to you. The flowers look gorgeous in the dining hall." "How lovely." She moved forward as if planning to rise. "Don't get up, Eleanor. If you don't mind, I'll go on in and leave one in your shower, then take the other two out to the shed." "Thank you, dear. Just leave the one in my shower if you don't mind. The others you can leave right there by the door, and one of my helpers can take it out back for me." Quickly, Tasha pulled the top bucket from the nest of three. "Yeow." Still holding onto the top bucket, she dropped the other two. They clattered onto the porch, each rolling in another direction. Blood spurted from a snake-like cut on Tasha's forefinger. "Oh, now you've cut yourself." Eleanor's voice quivered with concern. "You'll need to wash up in the bathroom. Take all the time you need." "Thanks so much. I'll be right back to pick up my mess." With one hand hugging the bucket to her side, Tasha gingerly opened the door and entered Eleanor's home. Dust danced on beams of morning light flowing through the back windows, accentuating the dichotomy of heavy handcrafted furniture against the brevity of space. Inside the bathroom, Tasha set the bucket into the shower, then switched on the sink faucet, allowing the cool water to run over her hand. She lathered up, hoping no infection would set in after slicing her skin with metal older than she. Tissues soaked by water and blood did little to stop the bleeding. "Not really time for this today," she muttered. With a kind of surprise, Tasha looked up from her first aid project and found herself staring into the bathroom mirror. She had the same untamed curls that she'd brought with her a year ago, but otherwise she had changed. And it had been from more than her surroundings, even more than from the love she had found along the way. She'd learned to be self-sufficient. To give up a job and the dream of marriage to her ex, and boldly find a new life here in Cottage Grove. Sure, she had gained a facial line or two, but who hadn't? They'd been earned, so there was no sense in denying them. Gratefulness flooded her, over all that she'd learned and become, and for the people whose lives she had found herself intricately involved with. She'd survived, cuts and all, and for that she was thankful. She blew out a breath, and flipped open the bathroom cabinet in search of a bandage. As her eyes scanned the shelves, the next breath she took caught in her throat. She wavered, gripping the mirrored cabinet door so tight she could feel it decompressing between her fingers. Tasha had been left at the altar and kidnapped all in the same year, and somehow survived. But for the life of her, she had no idea what to do about what she found in Eleanor's medicine cabinet, an antique green-ribbed glass vessel clearly marked arsenic. Tasha nearly ran back to camp, stumbling twice over the multi-pocked road that usually called for extreme caution. She couldn't think. Eleanor Gerbasi would not have poisoned Cooper. Would she? She replayed previous conversations with Eleanor. Had she expressed any dislike for Cooper? Think. Something about young Cooper being a know-it-all, trampling her garden, her bellowing at him. Tasha kept moving, anxious to get back to camp and talk to Marc. She had run out of Eleanor's home so quickly that she had not given herself time to plan what to do next. A breeze snapped at her and sent a chill through her hand. She glanced down to see fresh blood trailing along her finger and into her palm. In her haste to leave, She hadn't remembered to bandage her finger. She put her finger to her mouth, in an attempt to stop the bleeding. Footsteps approached from behind and she swung around. Tasha. What are you doing way out here? Beck stood behind her wearing a neat-as-a-pin plaid shirt, jeans and boots, but it was the gun in his hand that caught her eye. The salt from her wound had begun to turn her stomach. She pulled her finger away from her mouth and rolled her hand into a fist. She kept her eyes steady on his. I was just returning some buckets to Eleanor. And you walked? I know what you're thinking, she said slowly. But the group is being well taken care of, with Lorena in the kitchen, and Marc's crew working cleanup and security detail. It wasn't a judgment. He snapped his arm forward, the barrel of his .357 Magnum flashing her. She sucked in a breath. Wait. He watched her with a frown, then lifted one side of his shirt and tucked the gun into the holster at his waist. You okay? He asked. Her exhale sounded like a balloon deflating. She took one more deep breath before answering. Sorry. Yes, I'm okay. She held up her bloody hand. I cut myself at Eleanor's and was hurrying back to camp for some first aid. He peered at her hand. I don't like the look of that, Tasha. Looks deep. And now that I'm thinking about it, you look pale. Better have someone take you to urgent care. Can you do that? She nodded vigorously. Yes, of course. Thank you. Tasha turned back around and began to walk fast. She threw one "see you" over her shoulder, and then took off running. She didn't try to make sense of the jumble of thoughts she had concerning Eleanor or Beck or anyone else. Instead, she kept running until she reached the far end of a grouping of cabins, then slowed to a walk to catch her breath. Working out had never been particularly high on her list of self-helps, but she determined that starting tomorrow it would be. Girls were milling about, most of them gathered on the porches of the cabins, talking about boys and makeup and other girls. Tasha tossed a perfunctory wave to the few who looked her way. At the end of the row, she noticed two girls sitting alone. One of them, the one with the dark curls like Tasha's, studied something intently on the picnic table. Don't worry, she was saying to the willowy blonde girl with her arm stretched on the tabletop. I can fix it for you. The older girl's shoulders seemed to relax. You're the best, she said. Tasha recognized her as the one she'd seen earlier, who had broken a nail playing volleyball. Now hold still, the younger girl was saying. I got you. The random, slice-of-life scene may not have captured the attention of most, but it made Tasha tear up just the same. Life could be so unpredictable, so brutal sometimes, and then suddenly, one person reaches out to another to save the day. In this case, a freshman helping a senior fix her broken nail. It's the million little acts of kindness that could restore a person's hope. She hurried toward main camp where she spotted Marc's truck. He must have heard her approach because he turned toward her with a big grin on his face. That grin quickly broke though when their eyes met. He rushed forward. What's wrong? She held up her hand, unable to get the words out. He reached for her hand and held it protectively. That's a nasty cut. What happened? That's not the problem. He frowned. Tasha, you don't look well. Have you eaten? No, but there's something I have to tell you. He nodded, pulling her along toward the mudroom. Let's get this cleaned up first. And I want you to sit down and get some fluids in you. Inside, they found their way to the small break room just off the kitchen. Tasha re-washed her hand while Marc grabbed the first aid kit from the storage closet down the hall. He returned, and after treating her wound with antiseptic, he wrapped clean gauze around her hand. This will suffice until we get you to a doctor, he said while taping the gauze closed. When he had finished, he kept her arm cradled in his lap. Now, he said, imploring her with those dark and caring eyes, what happened out there? She swallowed, her mouth suddenly going dry. Marc kept his eyes on her while he called out, Lorena. Lorena peeked around the corner. Tasha's hurt. Could you grab her some water and something to eat? Lorena's eyes widened. Absolutely. She returned quickly with the water, set it down in front of Tasha, and on her way back out, she rubbed her friend's shoulder, as if to convey that she was sorry about their argument. "I'll be right back with some breakfast." Tasha downed the water, then wiped her mouth with the back of her good hand. "What I have to tell you can't go out of this room. If that's what you want." She exhaled and nodded. Her voice was low, like a whisper when she finally began to speak. "I was at Eleanor's house when I cut myself on that stupid bucket handle. So I went to her bathroom to clean up, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. I figured it would be okay to look in her cabinet for a bandage, but..." Marc's brow furrowed. "Go on." She swallowed. "I found a bottle, a really old-looking bottle of arsenic." Marc's chin jerked up.
How do you know?
"Because it was labeled that way." He nodded. "I believe you, but I'm just stunned. That's how I felt. I ended up running out of there without the bandage."
So you didn't say anything to Eleanor?
She shook her head.
Nothing.
"Well, I said goodbye, but nothing else."
And did anyone see you?
"Was anyone else there?" "No. She was alone. I did run into Beck on the path. I was about halfway back by then." She stopped. "I told him I'd been at Eleanor's. Is that bad?" He set his jaw. "I don't know, Tash. But I'm going to have to break my promise to you and call Wes." "No. It would be like I'm turning her in without a trial. Listen. You know Eleanor. She's quirky and has all kinds of uses for things that most people would never think of. Maybe it's just a coincidence that something as strange as that would be sitting in her cabinet. Then let's ask her ourselves before getting Wes involved." He shook his head. "No way. For one thing, we could be charged with concealing evidence. For another, how do we know that sweet old Eleanor won't poison our punch?" Tasha rolled her eyes. "I'm going to go talk to her." "You're stubborn. You're just finding this out now?" "We both know the answer to that." She gave him a sad smile. "So you'll go with me?" He huffed out a groan and spiked the air with his palms. "Fine. I'll go with you." They sat together on Eleanor's couch, their knees touching. Eleanor had insisted on making them each a cup of afternoon tea, and they had accepted, though neither of them had taken a sip. "Now what is it that I can help you two lovebirds with?" Eleanor asked, as she sat across from them in a rocking chair that Charlie had made long ago out of a downed oak tree. Marc began. "Tasha found something here today that has caused her to be worried about you, Eleanor." "I see." She tilted her head slightly and looked at Tasha. "But you really don't need to worry yourself over me, dearie. I'm fit as a fiddle." "I agree," Tasha said. "You are healthier than women half your age, that's for sure." "Then what is it?" Tasha shifted toward Marc. He nodded once. "Eleanor, Tasha found a bottle labeled arsenic in your bathroom and well, it's made her and me very concerned." Eleanor stopped rocking in her chair. She pursed her lips and squinted, completely silent for several seconds. Then she burst out laughing with the strength of a 2-year-old. Marc and Tasha exchanged a glance.
Oh, that.
Eleanor laughed harder. "That old bottle has been in there for many years. My Charlie had such a sense of humor. He put that pretty bottle in there years ago as a joke, said if I didn't make his coffee just the way he liked it, he might have to poison me." Tasha grimaced. "With all due respect, that hardly sounds like a joke." She jabbed Marc with her elbow and hissed, "Just so you know, I wouldn't find that funny." Eleanor kept smiling. "Well then you don't understand my Charlie. Take a look around." "Go ahead." Both Marc and Tasha looked around the room crowded with oversized furniture. Every piece of wooden furniture in this house was made by Charlie, mostly from trees that had fallen in Cottage Grove. Whenever a tree would fall on someone's property, they would call on Charlie to haul it away for them. He saw every single one of those tree trunks as a possibility, so he would fashion the wood into furniture. "I didn't know that, Eleanor. It's a lovely story, but I don't see how that explains why arsenic is funny." "He used it as a wood preserver." Oh, now, I know that these days there are plenty of other ways to preserve new wood, at least, I think there is. But back then, a form of arsenic was used, and so that's what Charlie did. She started to rock in the chair again, her eyes toward the ceiling as if reminiscing. One day he asked me to make him a cup of coffee and bring it outside to him. I meant to, but I got distracted by this and that. You know how it goes. Anyway, he came inside the house an hour later with that silly bottle. Said it was my punishment for not bringing him his coffee. We just laughed and laughed. Tasha began to feel the tension flowing out of her body. Eleanor was innocent. She'd wanted that to be true, but the coincidence had been too much to overlook. Marc leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs. So, as far as you know, that bottle has never left your bathroom cabinet. She swiped the air.
Oh no.
Never. I never had the heart to take it out of there. It's always been a light-hearted reminder of him, if that makes any sense at all. Tasha nodded. It did. She might never fully get the joke, but she understood love and attachment and therefore Eleanor's reasoning for keeping such an odd gift around for so long. And yet something seemed amiss. She folded herself forward, matching Marc's stance. What about other people? Does anyone else use your bathroom? Even to her it felt like an intimate question, but she had to ask. No, not unless I have guests, of course. Tasha hung her head, trying to make sense of all this. Certainly Eleanor was not a killer, but what would happen if they kept this news about the presence of arsenic in her bathroom cabinet, of all places, from the police? Tasha blew out a breath, her eyes catching sight of her bandaged arm. Her head jerked up. Eleanor, what happens to the bucket that you fill with your cold shower water? Oh, I just use the overflow to water my garden. You lift that heavy thing all by yourself. Heaven's number. Who lifts it for you then? Why, the Adair brothers do. They take turns checking in on me, especially that Bane. He's always so sweet to help me with little chores around the house. She paused and covered her mouth. Oh dear. Is there more? Marc asked. A stricken look passed across her face. He always asks me not to say anything. Says that people should not draw attention to their own good deeds. I'm afraid I have violated his simple request. Bane and Beck. Both of the men, apparently, had access to the arsenic in Eleanor's cabinet. The thought boggled her. Of course that too could be a coincidence.
Couldn't it?
Tasha searched her mind for more questions. I have to ask, what other kinds of chores do Bane and Beck help you with around here? Oh, I don't know. Move things if I need them to. Not at the same time, mind you. They are very busy men. Of course, Tasha said, hoping Eleanor would continue talking. Beck is real good at getting rid of snakes for me. I used to have a handyman do that, but Beck comes more quickly when I call. So that would explain the gun. At least Tasha hoped it would. And Bane takes things out to the shed for me, like paint cans and such. I keep some gardening supplies out there too, and he keeps it all real tidy for me. Real tidy. Too big of a job for an old woman like me. I'm so glad those boys came back into town and volunteered to help me, just like they did when they were little. Well, before their mother passed. God rest her soul. Tasha thought back to the other day when she had entered that same shed looking for buckets. She strained her mind, trying to picture what she'd seen in there. She had pulled open the heavy door, and those buckets were stacked neatly right inside. Vaguely, she recalled scanning a look across the interior and seeing nothing but tall paint buckets with lids. Was there anything else? Did it matter? The shrill ring of Marc's cell phone startled them all. He grabbed it from his pocket, the corner of his mouth quirking upward. Sorry. I had the ringer up since I was working at camp. It's my foreman, so I have to take this. I'll go out front. Tasha watched Marc as he approached the front door, noting that the buckets she had left in disarray were sitting on the floor just inside. Eleanor must have brought them in. Marc stepped outside and leaned against the corner post, his voice low. Tasha turned again to Eleanor. Did Charlie ever keep arsenic in any other place around your property? Eleanor frowned. Yes, he kept all of his supplies out in the shed, but all you will find out there now is paint for the rooms of my house. Charlie died many years ago, and by then he had long finished building our furniture, so he wouldn't have had any need to buy more. That green bottle held the last of it, I believe. Tasha sensed a spike in her heart rate. She glanced out the door when she heard Marc's phone ring again. He stepped off the porch and was soon pacing in front of the house, his phone stuck firmly against his ear. She glanced at Eleanor. That makes sense. Well, she said, I think I'll just finish the job I started the other day if you don't mind and take those buckets back to the shed. That would be lovely, dear. Be careful though. I don't want you getting hurt again. Don't you worry about a thing, Tasha said, standing. She scooped up the 2 buckets and turned toward the back door. I will be just fine. 9. Eleanor's shed appeared to be as old as she. But it was solid and sturdy, just like its owner. Instead of being made of pressed wooden boards held together by shavings and glue, this one looked solid enough to survive anything that might come its way. No doubt Charlie had built it, board by board, with his own 2 hands. Tasha opened the heavy door, allowing it to swing wide, flooding the dark and packed space with light. She took 1 step up and entered. Then she put the stacked buckets inside the door and to the right, where she had originally found them. Though the interior had been exposed to daylight, her eyes still needed to adjust, so she could examine every inch, especially the dark corners. She wove her way through the maze of paint buckets, stopping here and there to read the handwritten labels: parlor, master bedroom, kitchen. Should Eleanor ever want to have the paint touched up inside her house, her painters would have no problem figuring out which bucket to open. Tasha stopped and scratched her head. As Eleanor stated, there was nothing much out there but paint and a couple of open buckets of stinky garden mulch. She spot-checked bucket after bucket and was about to turn around when a prickle of cold alighted on her neck. Her eyes had caught sight of a bucket that looked like all the others, even down to the label, which said, front porch. Only the handwriting looked different, and the label itself had not yellowed from age. She stretched to reach it, to run her forefinger across its face. With her middle fingernail, she scraped at the label's edging, and it peeled up like the thick peel of a ripe banana. She squinted to read the label underneath the newer one, because it had yellowed extensively, and the ink had smeared. Dangerous. Arsenic. To preserve wood. Tasha gasped. Why would someone want to cover over this label? She whispered aloud. Why indeed? Tasha whipped her hand away from the bucket and spun around. Bain Adair stood in the doorway to the shed, backlit like the new sheriff in town. Only he did not look like he had come to save the day, far from it. Come out of the shed, Tasha, he commanded. Hey, Bain, she said in the calmest, most convincing tone she could muster. What's up? She heard the distinct click of a trigger and froze. Move quickly. She kept her eyes focused on Bain and the gleaming metal barrel staring back at her. Either the Adair brothers had a matching set of guns, or Beck had left his lying around for his brother to find. Hurry up. She picked up her pace, weaving around several buckets, her mind spinning. All along, Bain was their killer. A slithering dread wrapped itself around her lungs. Surely Marc would come searching for her soon. Or would he? That phone call looked intense. And if he did come looking for her, what would happen to him if he did? Silently she prayed for a way to alert Marc and the police that she had been taken against her will. On her way out of the shed, Tasha pretended to slip and accidentally kicked one full bucket of mulch so that it spilled haphazardly on the floor of the shed and down onto the ground below. It made a mess. Stop being clumsy. Hurry up. When she was out of the shed, Bain locked it with one hand while keeping the gun on her. When your boyfriend comes looking for you, he'll think you got your pretty little self locked inside. He'll think you're hurt and need rescuing. Too bad I'm the only one with a key. His laughter could roil even the strongest of stomachs. Bain, I don't know what this is about, she lied. I was just looking for paint for Eleanor's kitchen. She said it could use some brightening up. Is that why you ran out of here this morning like you'd seen a ghost? I was late for work. Please. Beck told me he ran into you. Said you looked pale. Hey, maybe you were the ghost. His cackle made her want to vomit. But you know what really tipped me off? Though he let the question linger between them, she refused to bite. He smiled as if he was having the time of his life. Sweat popped from his pores, drenching his forehead and cheeks. It was the blood. I don't understand. The blood. You were sucking your own hand. You told Beck that you had just been to Eleanor's, and that you had cut yourself. Now why, pray tell, would you wound yourself like that and not apply a bandage? I asked myself this very question. She swallowed the bile forming in her throat but kept her gaze steely. Okay, I'll answer for you. It's because you did look for a bandage, but oh no, you found arsenic instead. That's what happened, isn't it? She didn't answer. He pressed his lips together into a tight, thin smile. I knew you wouldn't be able to let things alone after that. You would question Eleanor and that dumb old woman would squeal like a greased pig. Let's go. Where? He gave her an incredulous smile. I'm making the decisions here. Go. He gestured with the gun. That way. She began to walk as slowly as possible, forcing away the shivers. A million thoughts collided inside her head. Vane, she started. Let me guess, you have a few questions. He let out a single laugh. You know, this was supposed to be easy. I had it all figured out, and then Cooper got greedy. I should have seen that coming. She had to stall him for as long as it took for Marc to realize she was gone, and to call for help. Seen what coming? See, this whole town had been hoodwinked by a lie. Everybody thought my father was a gambler, that he lost this place to the roulette table. But it wasn't true. She pressed her lips together. Maybe the old-timers did think that, but not everyone. Tasha herself had only recently learned this piece of gossip from Eleanor. Then again, Eleanor probably thought it was common knowledge, like Bane did. He continued. Cooper's dad, what a loser. All my father did was try to help the deadbeat, and what did he get for it? Nothing. After our mother died, and Cooper's dad gambled away all the money Dad had loaned him, we lost everything. He grabbed her by one arm, his eyes bugged. Do you know what that was like for us? She shook her head. He took an exaggerated breath and let go of her roughly, then pushed her to keep walking. When Beck said we should buy this piece of crap back, I thought, what for? Then Beck suggested we get Cooper in here to run the place. Said the guy had done wonders with his meager inheritance. Can you beat that? Any money that guy got from his low-life father should have been ours. He grunted again. I finally came around when Beck said that we ought to ask old Co-op to bring his sister on board. Said she had studied cooking at some fancy school and could probably turn the kitchen around in a hurry. Tasha's teeth clenched at the suggestion that a kitchen run by Lorena needed turning around. I liked the idea of that, always had a thing for Beth. He paused with a half smile, as if lingering on that last thought. And at first, all was swell. Co-op and I even came up with a little swindle that my brother knew nothing about. He wrote up a bunch of fake invoices for expensive equipment, some that we never actually bought, and the camp paid the bills. He and I split the markup 60/40. He leaned toward her. Since I was one of the owners, it only seemed fair. So what happened? Did Beck find out? Good guess, but no, Beck never found out. And he said, lowering his voice, he never will. Tasha was taking the smallest steps she could, but she could tell by the rising gruffness of Bane's tone that he was getting testy. But see, this is where things get complicated. Cooper suddenly decided that 40% wasn't enough for him. I shoulda saw that coming. He didn't want just 50%, he wanted the whole 60. So you killed him. He snorted a laugh. Turned out that way. Thought maybe I'd just poison him a little, that he'd get sick enough to quit. Guess I got a little sloppy. How did you get him out to the cliff? My, so many questions. It was all his fault, really. Said we should have a meeting away from camp, to discuss the details of our financial arrangement. So I said, sure, meet me at the cliff. He snorted. Sucker. Tasha's stomach contracted at the thought of all Bane had been doing right under their noses. This explained the days of illness leading up to Cooper's death, and his heightened obsession with coffee. Bane had been poisoning him all along, and the man was just trying to stay awake. And now we have a problem, don't we? She stole a look at him, hoping to see some humanity left. I blame myself, really. You see, I should have destroyed the evidence. A smarter killer would have thought of that. Alas, I am new at this, so you'll have to forgive me for that oversight. She continued to walk at a snail's pace in the direction of the cliff, from where Cooper had fallen. Another shiver traveled through her, and she rubbed her fingers together for warmth. That's when she realized that the label she had pulled off of the paint bucket was still stuck to her hand. Gently, she tore off a piece and dropped it at her feet. So as I was saying, you'll have to forgive me, Tasha. If only I had remembered to destroy the evidence, then I wouldn't have to kill you now, would I? She attempted to force away the shivers, but they came back in droves, chilling her insides. She tore another strip of the label off and dropped it at her feet. To the right, he said gruffly. We can't have them finding us so easily, now can we? They'll only think we're going to the same spot where Cooper fell. She turned to the right and dropped another piece of label. Then again and again, as they continued walking closer and closer to the rocky cliff above the ocean's edge. As they stepped off the clearing that delineated Eleanor's property from the wild, Tasha wavered. It would be much more difficult for Marc to find them in there. She dropped the last piece of label onto the ground. Feeling ill? She nodded. Maybe that would at least slow him down. He shoved her back. I don't care. Keep going. Tasha gripped her hands in front of her, her fingers rubbing against the gauze that wrapped her wound. She swallowed and poked a hole through the gauze with a fingernail. Quickly, she poked another hole and pulled off a small strip and dropped it at her feet. She did it over and over again as they trudged forward, Bane yammering on like a lunatic. Silently she prayed that he would never look down. There, he said, pointing in the distance. To that rock over there. Tasha steadied one hand over the other, in hopes that Bane would not notice that her bandage had shrunk considerably. She squinted to where her captor had pointed, a cliff that was deceptively flat. She'd been there many times when exploring the area with Wolfie. From this side it looked like the rock was smooth and flat and safe to venture out on, but if a person were to go too far, they'd find themselves barreling to the rocks below. It wasn't called sheer rock for nothing. Certainly Bane remembered this spot from when he was young. Come on, let's get this over with. He pushed the barrel of the gun into her back. Though she marched forward slowly, calculating every move, they reached the flat part of the rock far more quickly than she had hoped. The crash of waves below the cliff sent a sickening shiver up her back. She turned and abruptly sat on top of the rock. Really? We're going to play this game now. His laughter had begun to sound like a coughing fit, and the beads of sweat on his forehead had joined together to make a swamp. He spun the gun on his finger. You know what? I think I've made a decision here. Not going to use this after all. Why leave more evidence, you know? She lifted her eyes until they were staring directly into his. If she were going to die, she wasn't going to allow him to get away with not seeing exactly what he had done. If nothing else, maybe his conscience would someday slay him. You are a feisty one, aren't you? He said. She continued to stare, a glimmer of something in the distance catching her attention. She forced herself to focus on her captor, even though that distant force was moving swiftly toward them. See, here's what we're going to do, he continued. You're going to stand on that rock, and I'm going to point this gun at you. As long as you jump, I won't have to shoot you. And when they find you, at least you won't be a bloody mess, at least not on my account. How's that sound to you? Sounds like you have it all figured out, she said, trying to stall. By his cadence, Tasha could tell that Marc was almost to them. And he had someone with him. But you do know that this rock here has steps just below it, don't you? You're lying. Wasn't like that when we were kids. Well, with the camp here now, this rock proved to be much too dangerous with kids around. So we built a set of stairs. You know, so no campers would find themselves in danger. He squinted at her and stepped forward. Stand up and slide over so I can see. May have to change my plan here. She climbed up to a standing position as he hopped on top of the rock, keeping the gun on her. Without turning her chin, she let her eyes move enough to see that Marc and Wes had nearly reached them. They were using the trees for shields. He grabbed her by the arm, jolting her. Turn around. Show me those stairs. They are just down below the edge, she said, hoping Marc and Wes would make a run toward them yet still be safe. Was that even possible? She pointed toward the farthest edge of the jagged rock, and kept her voice steady. You have to go to the edge to really see them. Yeah. Then you're going with me. If you're lying, it's back to plan A. And that is... The hammer of his gun clicked. The steadiness that she'd used to control her voice vanished. Slowly, she lifted one foot to move toward the edge of the rock, when she felt herself falling swiftly backward. A hand clamped her mouth shut as she landed onto her back, a body beneath hers. Stay quiet, Wes whispered into her ear. A scrambling of noise and shouting above her perked at her ears. Marc, she shouted, only for her voice to be muffled by Wes's palm. In the next second, the crack of a gunshot split the air around them, followed by another shout, before all went calm. She lay there, her heart and lungs pounding. Marc. Tears pricked at her eyes, as Wes finally let her go to scramble up the side of the rock and peer over the top. 10. The guests gathered in the dining hall of main camp, the solemnity of the occasion not lost on any of them. Tasha lifted her glass. A toast. The others followed. Yes, a toast. She looked around the room at the faces of those she loved so very much. To the men who saved my life. All heads turned to Marc and Officer Wes, both of whom stood in the circle wearing the goofiest Christmas sweaters they could find at ye old antique and gem shop. Marc dazzled in a dancing version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, while Wes managed to find one laced with lights, many that still lit up. Hear, hear. Glasses clinked in a show of celebration, and laughter bounced around the room with abandon. Pastor Rick and his wife joined in, as did Eleanor, despite Bain's feeble attempt to keep her off the guest list. The dining hall itself had been transformed with strings of clear globe lights draped from the ceiling by a new maintenance crew that had been hired to give the beleaguered staff a break. A soaring pine surrounded by colorfully wrapped gifts filled one end of the room, and a trio of musicians played upbeat Christmas carols from the other. Wolfie snoozed quietly nearby, the antlers on his head drooping forward. As for the meal, Beth and Lorena had outdone themselves with a spread of gastronomic delights that would put grand Parisian chefs to shame. Is this one of the dishes Eleanor was teaching you to make in her home? Asked Mary Lou, the town's welcome lady, as she spooned roasted oysters onto her plate. Lorena's cheeks flushed. I'm so embarrassed that I made such a fuss over those classes. Nearly got myself arrested. Lorena had been hiding the fact that she had been taking cooking lessons from Eleanor, who had many secrets to share. Even Eleanor had kept their meetings to herself. Tasha gave her friend's shoulder a squeeze. I'm proud of you for always working to better yourself. It turned out that Lorena had gone to Eleanor's house on the morning of Cooper's demise to learn how to use her mocha pot. She'd wanted to impress Cooper with a cup of coffee that he'd never forget. Unfortunately, she'd never gotten the chance. Surrounded by chatter and more laughter, Tasha and Marc filled their plates and took their seats at a round table brimming with friends. Beck held a seat out for Beth, whose gaze held his for a length of time that suggested something more than friendship had developed between them. They'd both been on the receiving end of wrongdoing and tragedy, so no doubt, everyone in the room, including Lorena, was rooting for them. For the next hour or so, the cacophony of voices in the grand room rose and fell like the steady beat of a happy heart. When every belly was full, the crew of helpers quickly cleared away the plates and began bringing out trays of pfeffernusse, cutouts, ginger snaps and chocolate drops, and of course, 3 of Eleanor's banana cream pies, baked with love by Lorena and Beth. Lorena surveyed the table of desserts, her eyes sparkling. She snapped her fingers in the air. Oh. I completely forgot to make the coffee. She was too busy sampling the wassail, George quipped. Lorena giggled and slapped his chest. You. Hold on, everybody. It'll be made in a jiffy. She dashed into the kitchen. Several minutes later, Lorena emerged with a large pot of coffee, the smell of newly ground beans wafting through the room. One of the new crew members, Ernesto, jogged over to her. Whoa, let me help you with that. Together, they gently placed the industrial-sized pot of coffee on a separate table next to crystal dishware filled with sugar and cream. Lorena clasped her hands together. Okay, everyone, fancy coffee's on, compliments of Beth. Beth squinted and pursed her lips. She shook her head. I noticed the bag of Italian beans up on the counter, but I didn't bring them. She turned toward Eleanor, who sat like a queen bee at another table. Was that a gift from you? What? Eleanor asked, cupping her ear. I said, did you bring the Italian coffee? Oh, that. Yes, that was from my cabinet. Never drink the stuff myself anymore, but Cooper liked it, so I always made sure to have extra bags around to send over for him. The words dropped over the room like a shroud. Even the trio sensed the brewing storm and stopped playing. Bane had fallen to his death from that cliff before he had told Tasha exactly how he had managed to poison Cooper's coffee so often. After Cooper's death, the camp had taken extraordinary steps to disinfect any surface and appliance on the property, even though it was Cooper's personal coffee pot that had ultimately tested positive for arsenic. But what if it wasn't Cooper's daily cups that Bane had been poisoning, but the beans themselves? Oblivious to the drama unfolding, Mary Lou leapt up from her seat, took a cup from the table, and proceeded to reach for the coffee pot spigot. Tasha shook her head, her fingers splayed wide as stop signs. With eyes that suddenly understood, Lorena lunged forward yelling, "Stop!" then slapped the coffee cup out of Mary Lou's hand like she was beating egg whites for a stiff meringue. Tasha cozied herself against Marc's chest, her legs curled beneath her. Wolfie had rolled himself into a ball at the base of her couch, his soft snores the only rumble in the room. Across the small living room, in front of the picture window that framed the canyon below, a noble fir stood protectively, its branches bejeweled by white twinkling lights and decor of dyed shells and sea stars reflecting the sea. Marc shifted to one side. Tasha lifted her head. Am I hurting you? Never. Arm was just falling asleep, but it's okay. I have another. She let her eyes flop closed. A comfortable silence settled between them. Soon, Tasha drifted to that state of hovering somewhere between barely awake and asleep. Marc's husky voice brought her to the present. I think this living arrangement of ours is getting pretty old, wouldn't you agree? She smiled, eyes still closed. Oh, I don't know. I kinda like having you nearby. That's not what I meant. She laughed now. They'd met when he began building on the property next door to hers. Of course, she hadn't been all that happy to see him. After all, with his arrival came a load of strangers kicking up dust and wreaking all kinds of noisy havoc just outside her door, when all she had wanted to do was hide from her problems. But he had won her over, and eventually, she had grown to love the masterful way he built his two-story cabin next door. It hadn't hurt that he'd often tossed aside his t-shirt while working on his house during particularly warm days. Nor that he had chosen not to cut down the massive pine that shaded her tiny cabin. He continued, It's nearly done, you know. She nodded. I know, and it's so beautiful. He sighed. If only I'd found more time to work on it this year, then you and I would be over there right now, sitting in the glow of a 10-foot tree. She pulled herself up to look at him. The intensity of his gaze melted her, called her to him in a way she'd never known. She would do anything for this man. No regrets, she said gently. Marc had already shown her how deep his love ran, he nearly lost his life saving hers. And she had thanked God every day since that Bane had not been a better shot. The tree trunk that had taken a bullet from Bane's gun as he flipped backward down the cliff and into the unforgiving sea would survive. She shuddered to think about what could have been. Marc stood to his feet and reached down to pull her up from the couch.
Come on.
I have a surprise. The night had been a doozy. She had worked all day preparing for the big neighborhood Christmas party, and then suffered a spike in blood pressure, as did everyone else in the room, at the discovery that some of Bain's arsenic-laced coffee beans still managed to exist. But her man wanted her to rally, and so she did. He pulled her into his embrace. "Get your coat," he whispered into her ear. Christmas was days away, and the Northern California air had turned accordingly cool, brisk even. After putting on her coat, she wrapped a scarf around her neck, then gave him a plucky smile. "Ready?" He whistled sharply. "Wolfie, you coming, boy?" The dog perked up and hopped from his rolled position as if he had not just been in deep slumber. He trotted over and stood next to them. Marc bent down and kissed Tasha on the lips, then pulled her out the door. With Wolfie in tow, they traversed the cleared land between their two properties, swiftly reaching his deck. He fumbled a bit for his house key, eliciting nervous laughter from them both. Finally, he opened the door, reached in to switch on the lone chandelier in the center of the entry, and let her enter first. She spun around on her toes and reached up to give him a kiss under his chin. "This place is going to be so gorgeous when it's done." "You think so?" She stepped back, her arms wide as she turned, looking upward. "You've done a mighty fine job, cowboy. Now that you've hired more help, I see progress in your near future." "I'm glad to hear you say that." "Why wouldn't I?" She laughed. "No reason." He pulled her close suddenly then, his mouth caressing her hair, her forehead. His arms traveled up her body, until he cradled her face in his hands, then leaned in until their noses nearly touched. "Thank God I didn't lose you." She allowed her eyes to shut in the moment, breathing in the same gratefulness as he. "I had a plan for tonight, Tasha," he started, "but things got out of hand at the party, so I thought maybe I'd hold off until another time." "I agree." Things did not go exactly as planned tonight, although the lobster bisque was stunning. He shook his head, a grin forming on his face. "My gut, though, is telling me not to wait any longer. Life will never be truly still, will it?" She tilted her head to one side. "In the past year alone, I've come to learn that perfect moments come from what we make of them." That grin of his grew wide. "Then let's make this one of those perfect moments, shall we?" Slowly, he lowered himself on one knee to the hard cement floor. He pulled a ring from his pocket and placed it in her hands, enveloping them in his. "Tasha, will you marry me?" Her eyes glistened as she stroked the side of his face with her fingers. "I thought you'd never ask, cowboy." She laughed then, her tears giving way to fearlessness as they rolled with abandon and cascaded down her face. "Yes," she said. "I absolutely will." A little more than a year ago, she'd fought to keep Marc away from her property, and he'd fought to stay. They had played tug-of-war with their territories and their emotions, and both ended up winning. She was beginning to understand that perfect moments, those calm ones that are often dreamed about, don't always happen without a struggle. But when they do, magical. "Merry Christmas, love," she whispered. "Right back at ya," he whispered, then scooped her into his arms as if he'd never let her go. Thank you for listening to The Christmas Killer by Julie Carobini. Copyright by Julie Carobini. All rights reserved. Stayed for the recipe of Lorena's deadly wassail. Lorena's deadly wassail. Ingredients: 1/2 gallon 8 cups apple cider, 2 cups orange juice, 1/2 cup lemon juice, 1/4 cup sugar, 1 teaspoon cinnamon or 4 whole cinnamon sticks, 1 teaspoon ground cloves or can use whole cloves in a mesh bag, 1/2 teaspoon nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon anise seed, 1 to 2 oranges sliced, 1/4 cup whiskey, Lorena's choice but some prefer brandy. Combine the cider, orange juice, lemon juice, sugar and cinnamon in a large pot and over medium heat, bring to a boil. Turn the heat down to low and add the remaining ingredients except alcohol. Stir to combine and simmer for 20 minutes until the spices have blended well. Add the orange slices and alcohol if desired, and simmer for 5 more minutes. Turn off heat and serve hot in mugs. Enjoy.